1. My name is Leo Miller, and I want to tell you about the 19 hours during which I was, according to roughly 400 of my own classmates, the single worst person to ever walk the halls of Ridgeview High School, a title I earned entirely for something I never said, never typed, and never even thought, which is either the most unfair thing that has ever happened to a 16-year-old or the most educational, and honestly, looking back on it now, I'm still not sure those two things are mutually exclusive. It started on a Wednesday night at 9:47 p.m., a timestamp I know with total precision because I have since stared at it more times than I've stared at my own report card, when a screenshot began circulating through the junior class group chat, then the sophomore group chat, then, within about 40 minutes, every single social feed belonging to anyone who had ever set foot in our school. A screenshot that showed in the exact blue and gray bubble style of our school's messaging app, a conversation supposedly between me and my teammate Ethan Clark, in which I said something genuinely vile about a freshman named Alex Reyes. Something about how kids on financial aid shouldn't get to play varsity sports because their cleats probably came from a dumpster. A sentence so specifically, deliberately cruel, that reading it the first time felt like reading my own eulogy written by someone who hated me personally and had done meticulous research on exactly which words would do the most damage. I was lying on my bed doing precisely nothing interesting, half watching a rerun of a cooking show I don't even like that much, when my phone started buzzing so continuously, it eventually just became one long, unbroken vibration, like the phone itself was trying to warn me before I even looked at the screen. The first text I actually read was from my mother, from one floor below me in our own house, which should tell you everything you need to know about how fast this thing had already traveled. And it just said, "Leo, honey, what is this?" followed by a screenshot of the screenshot. And I remember sitting up so fast I nearly knocked my water glass off the nightstand, staring at those blue and gray bubbles with a specific, sick vertigo. Because I recognized the font, I recognized the little read receipt timestamp formatting. I recognized every visual detail of an app I used every single day. And yet I had absolutely no memory of ever typing a single word of what I was looking at. And for one genuinely disorienting second, I actually scrolled back through my own real message history with Ethan. Some deep, panicked animal part of my brain needing to double-check that I hadn't said this in some blackout of cruelty I'd simply forgotten, before the rational part of my brain caught up and reminded me that this was, in fact, impossible, because I had never once had that conversation about Alex Reyes, or financial aid, or cleats, or anything even adjacent to it in my entire life. I want to describe what the next hour felt like, because I don't think most people, thank God, ever get to experience the specific vertigo of watching your own name turn into a hashtag in real time. My phone simply would not stop. Group chats I'd been quietly muted in for months suddenly lit up with my name, again and again. Kids I hadn't spoken to since middle school suddenly weighing in with their own personal outrage. Several people I considered actual friends posting things to their own public pages, not tagging me directly but clearly, unmistakably about me. Captions like, "Some people show their true colors when they think no one's watching," and "disappointed" doesn't even begin to cover it. And I sat there on my bed with my thumb hovering over reply after reply, typing out, "That's not real. I never said that," deleting it, typing it again, deleting it again, because some part of me, even at 16, some part of me that had clearly absorbed more internet logic than I realized, understood instinctively that the worst thing you can do when 400 people already believe something is announce defensively that it's fake. Because the internet has a specific, brutal muscle memory for exactly what a guilty person's denial sounds like. And it sounds identical to an innocent person's denial, which means the actual content of the denial almost never matters as much as who says it first and how confidently. Alex Reyes, the freshman supposedly being mocked in that fake conversation, I want to be honest, I barely knew. I could have told you his name if pressed, because Ridgeview is not a huge school, and freshmen on the JV soccer roster occasionally cross paths with varsity players in the weight room, but I had maybe exchanged 4 total sentences with him in my entire life. Nothing about cleats, nothing about money, nothing about anything. And the specific horror of that fact, that I was being publicly executed for cruelty toward a kid I barely had a relationship with at all, made the whole thing feel even more surreal. Like being convicted of a crime that happened in a city I'd never visited. By the time my dad knocked on my bedroom door around 10:30, I was sitting on the floor with my back against the bed, phone finally face down beside me because I genuinely could not look at it anymore. And he came in and sat down next to me without saying anything for a solid minute, which is very much my dad's style. He processes things slowly and out loud eventually, but never all at once. And finally he said, "Your mother showed me the thing, and I need you to just tell me straight. Did you say any version of that, even as a joke, even in a way that got twisted?" And I looked at him and said, "Completely honestly, Dad, I swear on anything you want me to swear on, I have never said one single word of that sentence in my life." And he studied my face for a long moment, the specific parent radar look that can apparently detect a lie from across a room, and then nodded, slowly, and said, "Okay, then we're going to figure out how to prove that, because right now, kid, the whole internet has already decided you're guilty, and the internet does not care how you feel about that." My mother, I found out only later, spent that same night doing something I hadn't even considered as an option, which was quietly reaching out, one by one, to the mothers of my 3 closest teammates. Not to demand anything, not to make a scene, just to ask, calmly, whether their sons genuinely believed I'd said what the screenshot claimed, and to mention, gently, that she'd raised me her entire life and had never once heard me speak that way about anyone. A small, unglamorous piece of maternal diplomacy that I didn't fully appreciate until years later, when Zoe's mother mentioned it to me at one of our reunions, laughing, saying that call was the reason Zoe held her ground even partially that week, because her own mother had come to her afterward and said, "Leo's mom sounded genuinely certain, and mothers generally know their own kids better than a screenshot does." My father, for his part, spent that first night doing the thing he does best, which is research. Methodically, without much emotional flourish, staying up until nearly 2 in the morning, reading everything he could find about message app authentication and metadata, printing out, in classic, slightly overzealous dad fashion, an actual stack of articles about digital forensics that he left on the kitchen table the next morning with a sticky note that just said, "Thought this might help, love, Dad." Most of which turned out to be more basic than anything Sage eventually showed me, but which meant, walking downstairs that first devastating Thursday morning, I at least had visible, physical proof that somebody in my own house was already fighting for me rather than just waiting to see how it played out. I did not sleep that night, not really. And I want to tell you honestly that I have never in my life dreaded walking into a school building the way I dreaded it that Thursday morning, standing in my driveway for a full extra minute before getting in the car. My mother watching me from the front step with an expression that was trying very hard to be reassuring and failing, because we both knew, without either of us saying it, that nothing she could say was going to change what waited for me inside that building. The hallway, when I walked in, did the thing hallways do in movies that I always privately assumed was exaggerated for dramatic effect, which is that it actually did go quiet. Not completely, not like a movie, but noticeably, a ripple of lowered voices and sideways glances tracking me from the front doors all the way to my locker. Kids I'd known since elementary school suddenly finding their shoes fascinating whenever I made eye contact. And by the time I reached homeroom, I had counted exactly 0 people who'd said good morning to me, on a hallway where I usually got at least a dozen. My own friend group, the guys I'd eaten lunch with every single day since freshman year, the guys I genuinely would have called my closest friends on earth 24 hours earlier, handled it in ways that told me more about each of them than 3 years of actual friendship somehow had. Ethan Clark, my supposed conversation partner in the fake screenshot, the actual real teammate whose name had been used without his knowledge any more than mine, avoided me so completely that first day that I genuinely wondered if he'd been sent home sick, until I saw him at lunch sitting 2 tables away from our usual spot, laughing at something with a group of kids I barely recognized, very deliberately not looking in my direction even once. And when I finally caught him alone by the water fountain and asked, point blank, if he even believed I said it, he wouldn't quite meet my eyes and said, "Look, man, I don't know what to believe. It's just safer for both of us if I'm not, like, seen defending you right now. You get that, right?" And walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with a specific, quiet devastation that somehow hurt worse than any of the strangers' outrage online, because strangers had never actually known me, and Ethan had. Zoe Evans, who I'd known even longer than Ethan, since our moms had been in the same book club back when we were both in diapers, handled it differently, in a way that I've had a lot of time since then to think about. Because Zoe didn't disappear entirely. She still sat near me at lunch that first day, still said hi in the hallway, but there was a new, careful distance in everything she did. A visible flinch whenever anyone else glanced our way, a habit of changing the subject fast whenever the screenshot came up. And at one point, when a girl from student council stopped by our table specifically to ask Zoe, pointedly, in front of me, "Are you sure you want to be seen with him right now?" Zoe didn't defend me, but she didn't leave either. She just said quietly, "We've been friends a long time. I'm not going to just abandon that over a screenshot," which felt, in the moment, like a genuinely small and insufficient thing to say, and which I would come to understand much later was actually one of the harder sentences anyone said to anyone that whole week, because staying in the blast radius, even halfway, even nervously, cost something that fully disappearing, like Ethan had, did not. The teachers were, on the whole, professionally neutral in the specific way trained adults are professionally neutral when they have absolutely no idea what's actually true, though I did catch Mrs. Doherty, my English teacher, looking at me for one long, searching moment during first period, like she was trying to read something off my face that a screenshot couldn't tell her. And Coach Harrison pulled me aside before practice that afternoon, arms crossed, and said without any preamble at all, "I need you to understand that until this gets sorted out, one way or the other, you're benched. Not as punishment, just as caution. And I want you to know I don't love doing this, but I've got a locker room full of kids who are all forming opinions right now, and my job is to keep the team functional while the adults figure out what actually happened." And I nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and sat on that bench during my own team's practice, watching guys I'd played alongside for 3 years occasionally glance over at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered onto their field. The locker room afterward was its own particular kind of miserable. Guys changing in near silence, none of the usual chirping and noise that normally filled that room after practice. And I remember sitting on the bench in front of my own locker, lacing up my shoes slower than necessary just to have something to do with my hands, when one of our defenders, a quiet junior named Julian, who I'd never been especially close with, sat down next to me, not looking at me directly, and said, low enough that only I could hear it, "For what it's worth, I don't believe it. My sister's in your grade. She said the whole thing reads weird, like it's trying too hard." And I said, "Thanks, man, genuinely." And he just nodded once and went back to his own locker, and that was it. No big speech, no public declaration, but it was the first thing anyone at that school had said to me all day that didn't feel like walking on eggshells, and I held on to it. That small, undramatic kindness from a guy I barely knew, more tightly than I probably should admit, because it turns out you don't actually need every single person to defend you loudly. You just need enough of them, here and there, saying the quiet version of the same thing to keep from completely drowning. Principal Tanaka called me into her office by the end of that first day, my parents already there having rushed over from work, and the meeting was calm and procedural in a way that somehow made it scarier. Not accusatory exactly, but thorough, careful. The specific tone of an adult who has clearly done this exact meeting with other kids before and knows precisely how much rides on getting it right. And she told me, plainly, that the school was taking the screenshot's authenticity seriously as an open question, that they'd already reached out to the district's IT department to see whether anything could be verified on their end. But that message content sent through personal phones on personal data was, legally, mostly outside the school's ability to independently confirm or deny, which meant, functionally, that I was going to be sitting in a kind of institutional limbo for however long it took someone, somewhere, to actually prove something concrete. I want to tell you honestly that by the end of that first full day, walking out to my mom's car in the parking lot with my hood up and my head down, I had more or less resigned myself to the idea that this was simply going to be my life now. That Ridgeview High School had collectively decided in the space of about 12 hours exactly who I was, and that no amount of quiet, patient denial on my part was ever going to be louder than one perfectly timed, perfectly cruel screenshot. It was only that night, scrolling numbly back through the wreckage of my own social feeds for what felt like the 100th time, cataloging exactly who had liked which outraged post, that I noticed something small and strange enough to snag in my brain the way a splinter does. which is that one specific name belonging to one specific person in my grade appeared absolutely nowhere in any of it. Not a repost, not a comment, not a single like on a single call-out, in a class of over 90 kids, where by that point nearly everyone had weighed in on something. And the name belonged to a quiet junior named Sage Romero, a girl I had, if I'm being completely honest with myself, spent the last 2 years mostly ignoring, filing away in the vague mental folder labeled, kind of a loner, always has headphones in, keeps to herself, without ever once actually wondering what was underneath that description. And it struck me, lying there in the dark at nearly midnight, that out of an entire school that had reached a swift, confident verdict on my character in under a day, the one person who hadn't said a single word either way was the one person I'd never bothered to have a real conversation with. In 3 years of sharing hallways. I didn't do anything with that observation right away, mostly because I didn't know what there was to do with it, filing it away as one small, strange data point in a week that had already produced far too many of those. And I went to school that Friday bracing for more of the same quiet, hallway-wide social exile, which is more or less what I got, right up until 5th period study hall, when a folded piece of paper landed on my desk, passed hand to hand down the row in the specific, deniable way notes have traveled through classrooms since long before any of us were born. And I unfolded it expecting, honestly, some new cruel joke, and instead found 4 sentences in small, precise handwriting that I didn't recognize at all. It said, "The screenshot is fake. I can prove it. Meet me by the library after school. Don't tell anyone yet." There was no name signed to it, which felt, in the moment, almost aggressively mysterious, like something out of a spy movie rather than a Friday afternoon at Ridgeview High, and I spent the rest of that period doing the same kind of quiet, anxious detective work I imagine most people would do in that situation, glancing around the room trying to guess who might have passed it, before finally just deciding, given the strange non-coincidence of timing, to actually show up and find out. Sage Romero was already sitting on the low concrete wall outside the library when I got there, laptop bag across her chest, headphones around her neck instead of in her ears for once, and she looked up when I approached with an expression that was somewhere between nervous and grimly determined, the specific look of someone who has rehearsed exactly what they're about to say and is still not entirely sure they have the nerve to say it. I said kind of stupidly, "Was that you, the note?" And she said, "Yeah, sorry, I know it's dramatic. I just didn't want to say anything out loud where people could overhear." And then, without much more preamble, she opened her laptop, angled the screen toward me and said, "Okay, look, I need you to actually understand what you're looking at, because if you just tell people it's fake without explaining why, nobody's going to believe you. They're going to think you're just saying that because you got caught." What followed was, I want to be honest, about 15 minutes of the most oddly reassuring, deeply nerdy explanation I have ever received in my life. Sage pulling up the original screenshot alongside a handful of comparison images from her own message history with actual friends, walking me through it with the calm, patient precision of someone who has clearly spent a large amount of unsupervised time messing around with photo editing software purely for fun. She showed me the font first. A subtle but, once she pointed it out, completely obvious difference in the letter spacing on certain characters, explaining that the messaging app had pushed a font update 2 updates ago that changed the kerning on lowercase g's and y's in a way almost nobody would consciously notice unless they'd spent, in her words, an unreasonable number of nights customizing their own message bubble themes for fun. And the screenshot, dated as supposedly sent the night before, was still using the old font entirely, meaning whoever built it had either taken the base screenshot from months earlier or built the whole thing in an editing tool using an old reference image. Then she showed me the read receipt placement, a tiny detail I never would have noticed in 100 years, explaining that our school's app displayed read timestamps on the left edge of the bubble for received messages and the right edge for sent ones. And in the screenshot, both the supposed message from me and the supposed reply from Ethan had their timestamps on the same side, an inconsistency that made no logical sense for 2 separate people texting each other unless the whole conversation had been built inside a single edited image rather than captured from an actual live conversation. I sat there on that concrete wall staring at her laptop screen, feeling something complicated wash over me. Enormous relief, obviously, the specific, dizzying relief of finally holding something concrete after 2 days of drowning in nothing but other people's certainty, but also a genuine, sharp confusion. Because I looked up at her and asked honestly, "Why do you even know all this?" And she looked briefly uncomfortable, glancing down at her own hands before answering, and said, "My grandmother runs an antique shop, and she gets scammed constantly by people trying to sell her doctored photos of fake provenance for furniture and paintings. So I taught myself how to spot edited images a couple years ago just to help her out. And I guess it just became kind of a hobby after that, noticing when things don't quite line up." And I said, "That's genuinely the coolest reason I've ever heard for anything." And she looked surprised, like she hadn't expected that reaction at all, like she'd braced herself for me to find the whole thing strange or embarrassing instead. I learned the rest of it slowly, over that first week and the weeks after. In the careful, unhurried way Sage revealed most things about herself, never all at once, never as a bid for sympathy, just small facts offered when they happened to be relevant. Her father had died when she was 7, an aneurysm, sudden and entirely without warning, the specific kind of loss that doesn't announce itself in advance to let a family brace for it. And her mother, a pediatric nurse who'd gone back to work full-time within 2 months out of financial necessity, had spent the following decade quietly, exhaustedly, holding their small household together on double shifts and sheer stubbornness. Which meant Sage had grown up fast in the specific way kids do when a parent is loving but perpetually stretched too thin to hover, learning early how to occupy herself, how to be self-sufficient, how to find whole worlds of her own inside a laptop and a stack of her late father's old camera equipment that nobody had ever gotten around to selling. Ingrid, her grandmother on her father's side, had stepped into some of that gap without ever making it feel like charity, inviting Sage to the shop most Saturdays since she was 9 years old, initially just to get her out of an empty apartment while her mother worked. And it was there, sorting through decades of donated and consigned photographs, that Sage had first started noticing the small technical inconsistencies that mark a fake from a genuine one. A skill that started as simple curiosity and slowly, over years of unsupervised Saturday afternoons, became the specific, quiet expertise that would eventually save my entire reputation. I asked her, once the technical explanation had settled in my brain enough to think about something other than pure relief, why she'd even bothered. Why she'd spent what must have been hours combing through fonts and timestamps for a guy who, as far as I could remember, had never once had a real conversation with her. And her face did something complicated then, and she said quietly, "You really don't remember, do you?" And my stomach dropped, because the way she said it made it very clear there was something specific she meant. And I said, "Remember what?" Genuinely bracing myself, and she told me. Sophomore year, as group project in world history, she'd been assigned to my group along with 2 other kids, and she'd shown up to the first planning session with an entire outline already prepared, sources cited, a genuinely thoughtful structure for the whole presentation. And I had, in the specific, careless way 16-year-olds do things without registering the weight of them, glanced at it for about 4 seconds, said something like, "Cool, but I think we should just do it the normal way," and moved on to talking with the other 2 guys in the group about which slides to make, effectively steamrolling her entire contribution without a second thought. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear, just out of the thoughtless, low-grade dismissiveness of a kid who'd never once had to consider that someone quieter than him might have something worth actually listening to. I sat there on that concrete wall with a slow, sick recognition creeping up my spine, because I did remember it, once she described it, a small, forgettable moment from over a year earlier that I had filed away, if I'd thought about it at all, as nothing, a minor logistics decision in a group project nobody cared about. And hearing it land in her memory as something significant enough to still carry around made me feel, for the first time in this whole disaster, genuinely ashamed of something that had absolutely nothing to do with a fake screenshot. I said, "Sage, I'm so sorry. I don't even remember doing that on purpose." And she said quickly, "I know, that's actually the point. You weren't cruel about it. You didn't even notice you were doing it." Which somehow made it worse in a way I couldn't totally explain until this week, watching what happened to you. Because I recognized it, the exact feeling of being erased without anyone even registering they were doing it, just faster and louder, and with the whole school watching this time instead of 3 people in a history classroom. And something about seeing that happen to you, even you, specifically, made me want to be the one person who actually looked closely enough to notice something was wrong. I didn't have a good response to that, so I just sat there for a moment letting it land. And then I said the only honest thing I had, which was, I don't know how to make up for something I didn't even know I did, but I want to try. And Sage, looking briefly startled by the directness of that, said, you can start by actually telling people the truth the right way, with proof, not just denial, and I'll help you figure out how. And that, more than the fonts or the timestamps or any of it, was the actual moment I think our whole friendship started. Not with gratitude exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but with the specific, humbling experience of being shown, clearly and without cruelty, exactly how small and careless I'd once been to the one person who ended up saving me. We didn't rush the reveal. That was Sage's idea, and I resisted it at first, every impatient bone in my body wanting to march into Principal Tanaka's office that same Friday afternoon and lay the whole technical breakdown out on her desk. But Sage talked me down, pointing out correctly that we needed the proof airtight and presented calmly by an adult who'd take it seriously, rather than two panicked teenagers waving a laptop around, and that in the meantime, since we now knew for certain the screenshot was fabricated, the far more useful thing to spend the weekend doing was figuring out who actually had a reason to fabricate it. Because a fake this specific, using real names, a real app's exact visual style, and a target, Alex Reyes, who I barely knew, wasn't random cruelty. It was aimed, and aimed things have a source. That project, more than anything else that whole week, is what actually taught me who my friends were. Because instead of spending the weekend miserable and isolated, I spent it doing something active, which turns out to be an enormously better use of dread than just marinating in it. And it required, more than anything, watching people, really watching them, the way Sage had apparently been quietly doing to the entire social ecosystem of Ridgeview for years without anyone noticing. I started, embarrassingly, by suspecting Zoe for about half a day, which I still feel a little guilty about even now, reasoning in the specific paranoid logic of someone who's just been betrayed by reality itself that her half-hearted hedge-your-bets loyalty could have been a performance covering something worse, a theory that collapsed instantly and completely the moment I actually watched her at lunch on Saturday when we all met up at the diner near school under the flimsy cover story of studying for a test none of us cared about, quietly, without being asked, pull up an old thread of messages between us from 2 years earlier, unprompted, and say, I've just been sitting with this all week, and I went back and reread everything you've ever said to me, and none of it, not one message, sounds like someone capable of what that screenshot says. So I don't actually think you did it. I've just been too scared to say that loudly where people could hear me, and I felt, hearing that, a specific mixture of relief and frustration, because it confirmed Zoe wasn't the architect of any of it, but it also crystallized something Sage had said to me earlier that weekend, which was that fear and complicity aren't the same thing, but they can look identical from the outside. And figuring out the difference requires actually asking people the question instead of just judging their silence. I asked Zoe much later that year, once things had settled enough that the question no longer felt loaded, why her fear had run so much deeper than it seemed to for other people who ultimately came around faster. And she told me something I hadn't known, that her older brother had gone through something similar during his own senior year at a different school. A rumor that snowballed into a full social exile that never really got resolved before he graduated and left for college, still carrying it. And that watching her own family deal with the fallout of that, her parents' helplessness, her brother's slow withdrawal from basically every friendship he'd had left her with a specific, ingrained terror of ever being close to the center of something like that again. Not because she doubted me, but because some old, protective part of her had decided that proximity to a scandal, any scandal, guilty or not, was inherently dangerous, and it had taken her the better part of that whole week to talk herself down from that inherited fear enough to actually stay close, instead of quietly drifting the way she'd watched her own family drift years earlier. Hearing that explained so much I hadn't understood at the time, the specific, careful half-distance she'd kept, present but guarded, and it made me grateful. In a different way than I was grateful to Sage, for the fact that she'd shown up at all, despite carrying that particular weight. Because bravery, I was learning, over and over that year, rarely looks the same twice, and asking everyone to perform it identically was its own kind of unfairness. Ethan Clark, by contrast, only got more suspicious the more I watched him. Not because I thought he'd built the screenshot himself, his own name was on it too, dragged through the mud right alongside mine, which made him an unlikely architect of his own humiliation. But because of how quickly and how completely he'd cut ties, how instantly, unlike Zoe, he'd not just gone quiet, but actively distanced himself, laughing loudly with a new group of guys I'd never seen him hang around before. Guys who, I realized on Sunday afternoon watching a video someone posted from a weekend party I hadn't been invited to, were the exact same guys who'd been most aggressively amplifying the original screenshot online. I mentioned this to Sage that Sunday night over a video call, the two of us dissecting the whole social map of our grade like a pair of extremely underqualified detectives. And she said something that reframed the whole investigation for me, which was that I needed to stop looking for the person who seemed guiltiest and start looking for the person who benefited most. Because guilt, especially performed guilt, tells you almost nothing. But motive narrows things down fast, and the two most obvious motives for a fake this specific, using a real freshman as bait, were either someone who actually hated Alex Reyes and wanted to hurt him by proxy through someone else's reputation, or someone who specifically wanted me discredited, benched, humiliated, removed from something. And when she said removed from something, I felt an idea click into place that I hadn't let myself fully consider yet. Because varsity captain elections for the following season were coming up in exactly 3 weeks, a vote the team took seriously, an honor that had genuinely mattered to me since freshman year. And there was exactly one other guy on that roster who wanted it just as badly, a midfielder named Adam Hughes, who I'd always considered a rival in the friendly, competitive, nothing personal sense that teammates are supposed to have, and who had, now that I actually thought back on it, been unusually quiet and unusually absent from any group chat discussing the scandal all week, a silence that, once I started actually paying attention the way Sage had taught me to, felt less like innocent distance and a lot more like someone very carefully staying out of the blast radius of something he already knew the shape of. We didn't have proof yet, not real proof, just a theory built out of election timing and unusual quiet, and Sage, ever the careful one, made me promise not to say a word of it to anyone, including Adam himself, until we actually had something concrete, which meant that Monday morning I had to walk back into a school that still believed the worst thing anyone had said about me all year, sit 2 lockers down from a guy I now privately suspected of destroying my reputation on purpose, and act completely normal. A genuinely exhausting kind of performance that I don't think I appreciated the difficulty of until I actually had to do it for 8 straight hours. What got me through that Monday, more than anything, was the fact that I wasn't doing it entirely alone anymore. Because Sage, who had spent 2 years eating lunch by herself at the far end of the library with her headphones in, started, without either of us really discussing it as a plan, just showing up at my usual table. First, tentatively, sitting at the very end near Zoe, then, by Wednesday, fully integrated into the middle of the conversation. And I watched, with a kind of quiet, grateful astonishment, as Zoe, who I'd worried might be territorial about a new person suddenly occupying space at our table during an already stressful week, instead leaned in almost immediately, asking Sage genuine, curious questions about the antique shop, about the font analysis, about how she'd even learned to do any of it. And by Thursday, the two of them were trading memes back and forth like they'd known each other for years, which told me something important about Zoe that I filed away gratefully, that her earlier hesitation had been fear of the mob, not coldness toward outsiders, and something even more important about Sage, which was that the isolation I'd always assumed was her preference had actually just been the absence, until now, of anyone bothering to make room for her. Sage took me to her grandmother's antique shop that Saturday, a narrow, crowded little store downtown called Ingrid's Treasures, wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered video store. And I want to be honest that walking in felt a little like stepping into a different century. Dim lighting, the specific dusty smell of old wood and older paper, shelves crammed with teacups and pocket watches and framed photographs of strangers' long-dead relatives. And Sage's grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ingrid, who spoke with a faint accent I couldn't quite place, looked up from behind the counter, took one look at me and said, without any greeting at all, "So you're the soccer boy who got framed. I read about it. Come here, let me see your face." and proceeded to study me with an intensity that made me genuinely nervous, before apparently deciding I passed inspection and declaring, "Well, you don't look like a liar, but then again, neither did the man who tried to sell me a fake Tiffany lamp last spring, so what do I know?" Which made Sage laugh so hard, she had to put down the box of vintage postcards she'd been sorting. I spent that whole afternoon in the back room of the shop while Sage worked through her usual Saturday job of cataloging new inventory, half of it genuinely fascinating, old cameras and mechanical toys, and a truly beautiful antique globe that Ingrid let me spin twice. And half of it, I learned, involving the exact skill Sage had used to save me, examining a stack of supposedly vintage photographs someone was trying to sell as authentic, and Sage walking me through in real time exactly how she could tell 2 of the 6 were modern reproductions dressed up to look old, based on paper grain and ink saturation, and a dozen other small details I would never in a million years have noticed on my own. Watching her work that afternoon, completely absorbed, completely confident in a way she rarely seemed to be at school, I understood something about her that I don't think anyone at Ridgeview had ever bothered to learn, which is that Sage wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because the specific currency of high school, loud opinions about things that didn't actually matter, had simply never interested her. And she'd spent years being read as antisocial by people who'd never once asked her a real question about anything she actually cared about. It was also that same afternoon, sorting old postcards in the back room while Ingrid hummed something unrecognizable up at the front counter, that Sage finally asked me the question I could tell she'd been sitting on since the water fountain conversation a week earlier, which was, gently, "Are you actually doing okay? Like really okay? Not just okay because the immediate crisis is technically being handled?" And I realized, hearing it, that nobody had actually asked me that directly all week. My parents checking in constantly about logistics, about what the school was doing, about strategy, but nobody asking about the actual feeling underneath it. And I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, telling her the truth instead of the reflexive "fine" I'd been giving everyone else. That I kept replaying the specific sensation of scrolling through my own social feeds that first night. The sick, dropping feeling of watching people I'd known for years decide instantly that the worst possible version of me was also the true one, and that even now, even with proof sitting right there on her laptop, some small, stubborn part of my brain kept asking, what if people just believe the fake thing? Anyway, what if the truth doesn't actually travel as fast as the lie already did? Sage listened to all of it without interrupting, sorting postcards slowly the whole time, like the physical task gave both of us permission to say harder things than we could have managed sitting still and facing each other directly. And when I finished, she said, quietly, "For what it's worth, that fear doesn't go away completely just because you get proof. I still have it sometimes. 4 years after my own thing happened, some part of me that still expects to open my phone and find out everyone's decided something terrible about me again. And the only thing that's actually helped is collecting enough real evidence, not about screenshots, but about people. Enough proof that specific real humans will actually show up when it counts. That eventually the fear gets quieter, even if it never fully disappears." I asked her if it had actually gotten quieter for her, honestly, and she thought about it for a long moment, setting down the postcard in her hand and said, "Some days, yeah, actually. More since you started sitting at my table, if I'm being honest." And I said, "Well, then I guess we're both collecting evidence now." And she smiled, the small, real one instead of the polite one, and said, "That's a genuinely nerdy way to say we're friends." And I said, "I learned from the best." And she threw a postcard at my head, gently, which I took as an excellent sign that we were, in fact, going to be okay. Sage's mother, whose name was Diana, picked her up from the shop that evening still in her scrubs, exhausted in the specific, bone-deep way I later came to recognize as the particular exhaustion of 12-hour hospital shifts. And she paused in the doorway when she saw me sitting there, clearly registering, with visible surprise, that her daughter had an actual guest, a fact that Sage later admitted was rare enough to be genuinely notable in their household. Diana didn't ask many questions that first night, just a polite, tired hello and, "Are you the boy from the news?" A phrase that made me wince slightly until she added gently, "My daughter mentioned you. She said you were kind to her," which surprised me, since Sage doesn't usually bring people up unprompted. And I said, "Honestly, She was the one who was kind to me first. I'm just trying to keep up." And Diana looked at me for a long moment with an expression that reminded me, oddly, of my own mother's face the night she'd first heard about the screenshot. That same specific mixture of exhaustion and fierce, quiet protectiveness, and said, "Well, keep it up then. She doesn't let many people in, and if you're one of the ones she's letting in, I'd like you to stay that way." It wasn't until months later, once Diana and my own mother had properly met and, predictably, bonded instantly over the specific shared experience of raising a kid who'd survived something the rest of the world had barely paid attention to, that I heard the fuller picture of how hard that year had actually been on the Romero household underneath its calm surface. Diana picking up extra shifts specifically that fall to afford a lawyer consultation just in case the fake screenshot situation ever escalated into something requiring one. A quiet, unglamorous act of protection Sage herself hadn't even known about until my mother mentioned it in passing at a dinner 2 years later. And Sage, hearing it for the first time at that table, had gone very quiet, then reached over and squeezed her own mother's hand without a word, the two of them sharing a look that needed no further explanation for anyone else at the table to understand exactly how much had been carried, silently, underneath everything we'd all eventually laughed about at reunions. In exchange for that afternoon, feeling like I owed her something more concrete than gratitude, I offered to help her with the one thing she mentioned, almost offhand, while sorting postcards, that she'd been avoiding for months, which was a regional science fair proposal on digital image forensics that her physics teacher had been encouraging her to submit. An idea she clearly found genuinely exciting, but had talked herself out of twice already. Worried, she admitted, that standing up in front of a panel of judges and explaining her own work out loud would be its own kind of exposure she wasn't sure she wanted. I am, for the record, spectacularly unqualified to teach anyone about public speaking. My own most notable public speaking experience up to that point being a shaky freshman year presentation on the causes of the War of 1812 that I'm fairly sure I passed purely on volume. But I did know something about performing calm under pressure from 3 years of walking out onto a soccer field in front of a crowd, and we spent the following 2 weeks, in between everything else going on, practicing in her grandmother's back room, me playing the world's most obnoxious mock judge, asking increasingly ridiculous, fake serious questions until she was laughing too hard to be nervous. The exact same trick, it occurred to me later, that apparently works on basically every anxious, brilliant person if you're patient enough to actually try it. It wasn't all smooth sailing between us, and I think it's important to say that clearly, because I've noticed that people telling stories like this one tend to skip the part where two people who are suddenly spending all their time together inevitably step on each other's feelings at least once. And Sage and I had exactly one real fight during those 2 weeks, and it happened, embarrassingly, because I got impatient. We were 3 days out from the deadline for her science fair proposal, and she kept second-guessing the framing of her own project, rewriting the same paragraph 5 different ways, and I, frustrated on her behalf, tired of watching someone this obviously talented talk herself down over and over, finally snapped, a little too sharply, and said something like, "Can you just submit it already? It's good. You're just scared. Stop overthinking every single sentence." And Sage went very quiet in a way that I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact same quiet she'd probably gone for years whenever people dismissed her without meaning to. And she said, evenly, but with an edge I hadn't heard from her before, "That's easy for you to say. You've spent your whole life having people assume you're worth listening to. I've spent mine having to prove it every single time. So forgive me if overthinking a sentence feels a little more high stakes for me than it does for you." That landed hard and correctly because she was right, and I sat there for a second feeling genuinely small, recognizing, with a fresh wave of the same shame I'd felt hearing about the group project, that I'd just done a smaller, gentler version of exactly the thing I'd apologized for doing to her before, deciding my read on the situation mattered more than her actual lived experience of it. I apologized properly, not a quick sorry, but an actual accounting of what I'd done wrong, that I'd been impatient instead of supportive, that telling someone to just stop being scared is never actually helpful, even when you mean well by it. And Sage, after a moment, accepted it and said quietly, "Thank you for not making me convince you that you were wrong." And we sat together in her grandmother's back room, finishing the proposal at a slower, gentler pace after that. And when she finally submitted it 2 days later, hitting send on the application with both of us watching the screen in tense silence, she let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for weeks and said, "Okay, that's done. Whatever happens now happens." And I said, "For what it's worth, I think you're going to blow those judges' minds." And she rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. While all of that was happening, Sage and I were also, quietly, in the margins of everything else, still building our case against Adam Hughes. And I want to explain the actual shape of his motive, because it took a while to come into focus, and once it did, it made a specific, ugly kind of sense that I still feel a little sick thinking about. Adam and I had been friendly rivals since freshman year, the two fastest midfielders on the JV team back then. Both moved up to varsity the same season sophomore year, and for the most part, it had genuinely been the good kind of competition, pushing each other in practice, mutual respect, the kind of rivalry that makes both people better instead of bitter. What I hadn't fully appreciated, until Zoe, digging carefully on our behalf without ever quite knowing the full reason why, mentioned it almost offhand one afternoon, was that Adam's home situation had gotten significantly harder over the past year, his parents in the middle of a genuinely brutal divorce, money tight enough that his own cleats, ironically, the exact detail weaponized against Alex Reyes in the fake screenshot, had been a source of real embarrassment for him the season before, a fact he'd apparently mentioned to exactly one person in a moment of unguarded vulnerability, and that person, unbelievably, uncomfortably, was Alex Reyes himself. The two of them having briefly bonded the previous spring during a summer conditioning camp before Alex moved up from middle school, back when Adam was a mentor figure to the incoming freshman rather than a rival to anyone. Something had soured between them since then, exactly what we didn't know yet. But Zoe had heard, secondhand, that Adam had made some kind of bitter private comment about Alex during a group chat months earlier. Something about how ironic it was that a scholarship kid was suddenly getting more playing time than guys who'd actually paid full tuition for years. A genuinely ugly sentiment born, I suspect now, out of Adam's own private shame about his family's finances, curdling into resentment towards someone even less financially secure than himself. The exact kind of misdirected cruelty that happens when someone's own insecurity finds an easier, smaller target to punch instead of the actual source of their pain. That comment, we eventually pieced together, had apparently started to circulate in a smaller chat weeks before the fake screenshot ever surfaced. Just a handful of people, nothing viral, but enough that Adam, genuinely afraid of what it would cost him socially and with the captain vote coming up, panicked. And in that panic, using photo editing skills that we later learned he'd actually picked up from a completely unrelated hobby making memes for a gaming server he was part of, took his own real damning words and rebuilt them, word for word, into a conversation that swapped his name and photo for mine and Ethan's, effectively laundering his own cruelty through somebody else's reputation, a plan that had the added devastating benefit, from his perspective, of simultaneously removing his only real competition for team captain in one single move. We didn't have this whole picture at once. It assembled slowly over about a week and a half of careful, quiet observation. Sage cross-referencing timestamps on old public posts, Zoe gently asking around without tipping anyone off, me simply watching Adam more closely than I ever had in 3 years of being his teammate. And what I noticed, once I was actually paying attention, was a kind of low-grade, constant tension in him that hadn't been there before. A habit of checking his phone compulsively during practice. A new sharpness in his voice whenever Alex Reyes' name came up in any context at all. And, most tellingly, a very specific over-friendliness toward me personally that first week. Clapping me on the back at practice, saying things like, "Hang in there, man, this whole thing is so unfair," in a tone that I couldn't quite place at the time, but that landed in hindsight like the specific performance of someone checking whether the person he'd framed suspected anything yet. There was one close call, about 10 days into all this, that still makes my stomach tighten a little to think about. When Sage, digging through old public posts, trying to find any surviving trace of that original small group chat comment, accidentally liked a 2-month-old post of Adam's while scrolling too fast on her phone during lunch, a stray tap that notified him instantly, and I watched, from across the cafeteria, his head snap up, scanning the room until he found her, found us, sitting together, and something in his expression shifted, just for a second. A flicker of genuine alarm quickly smoothed back over into his usual easy smile, and he made his way over to our table a few minutes later, dropping into the seat across from me with a little too much casualness, and said, "Hey, you two seem to be hanging out a lot lately. Everything good?" And I said, "Yeah, man, just figuring some stuff out," keeping my voice as flat and unreadable as I could manage, and he held eye contact just a beat too long before nodding and moving on. And once he was out of earshot, Sage, staring at her own phone in mild horror, whispered, "I think I just made a mistake." And I said, "Maybe, but also maybe. It's fine." And neither of us actually believed that. Both of us spending the rest of that day with the specific low hum of anxiety that comes from suspecting you might have tipped your hand to the one person who most needed not to know you were looking. Nothing came of it immediately, no confrontation, no retaliation, just Adam noticeably tightening up around both of us for the next several days. Shorter answers, less of that performed friendliness, which honestly told us more than his earlier warmth had, because genuine indifference doesn't usually curdle that fast into visible discomfort unless something underneath it has genuinely started to worry. What actually broke the whole thing open in the end had almost nothing to do with anything Sage or I had been carefully assembling, which felt, at the time, like a strange kind of anti-climax, and which I've since come to think was actually the most honest possible ending for a story that started with someone else's cruelty rather than my own, because it meant the truth surfaced on its own weight rather than because I finally outmaneuvered anybody. Alex Reyes, it turned out, had been having a genuinely rough 2 weeks of his own, quietly enduring a much smaller, much less public version of exactly what I'd been going through. Kids on the JV team who believed the fake screenshots premise, even after most of the varsity roster had started to doubt it, muttering comments about scholarship kids whenever he missed a pass, and he finally broke down about it to the one adult he trusted, the school's counselor, a calm, unhurried man named Mr. Jenkins, describing, through what I heard later were actual tears, how humiliating it felt to have his financial aid status turned into a punchline for an insult he was fairly sure he'd heard some version of before, months earlier, secondhand, from a kid in his old summer conditioning group who'd mentioned, almost as a joke at the time, that Adam Hughes had said something nasty once about scholarship kids taking playing time from paying families. Mr. Jenkins, hearing that detail, the specific damning phrase almost identical to something already circulating months before any screenshot existed, brought it straight to Principal Tanaka, who by that point already had, sitting quietly in a folder on her desk, the full technical breakdown Sage and I had finally worked up the nerve to formally submit that same week, complete with side-by-side font comparisons and a careful written explanation, meant, honestly, mostly just to clear my name rather than to catch anyone specific, since we still didn't have proof solid enough to name Adam outright ourselves. Tanaka, cross-referencing Alex's account with the timeline of the original small group chat comment, which the district's IT department, working off a formal request she'd filed a week earlier, had finally managed to partially recover from server backups, despite most of it having been deleted, found the exact phrase, word for word, sitting there in a 2-month-old conversation with Adam Hughes's own name attached to it. The same ugly sentence about cleats and dumpsters and scholarship kids, unedited, undoctored, entirely his. Sage, once she finally got to see the recovered original alongside the fabricated version Tanaka's office had on file, walked me through exactly how Adam had built it, partly out of her own professional curiosity, and partly, I think, to make the whole thing feel less like dark magic and more like the mundane, learnable trick it actually was. And it turned out to be simpler than either of us expected. Adam had used a basic screen mock-up template, the same kind of tool he'd apparently used for months making joke memes of fake text conversations for his gaming server. A tool that lets anyone type in custom names, custom photos, and custom message bubbles styled to imitate almost any popular app. And all he'd had to do was drop in my name, drop in Ethan's, and retype his own real, damning sentence word for word into the template, never realizing, because the tool he used was built for jokes rather than deception and hadn't bothered updating its font library in over a year, that he was leaving behind the exact kind of small, technical fingerprint that Sage had spent years training herself to notice. Hearing the mechanism explained that plainly made the whole thing feel smaller somehow, less like an elaborate conspiracy, and more like a panicked kid making a low-effort, high-consequence decision with a tool built for entirely different purposes, which didn't make it hurt less, but did make it easier, eventually, to stop imagining Adam as some criminal mastermind and start seeing him as what he actually was, a scared 17-year-old who made an unforgivably bad choice under pressure and then had to live with exactly how far that choice traveled. I found out how the pieces had actually come together only afterward, secondhand, in the specific patchwork way you learn about your own life-altering events when you're not in the room while they happen, Mr. Jenkins mentioning it gently to Alex, Alex mentioning it stunned to a friend on the JV team, that friend mentioning it to Ethan, of all people, who then, in the single most redemptive thing he did that entire month, texted me directly for the first time in 2 weeks. A message that just said, "Hey, I think they found something. It might actually be Adam. Are you okay?" And I sat there staring at that text, feeling a complicated rush of vindication and something quieter and sadder underneath it. Because it meant the truth had come out almost by accident, through a scared freshman's private grief rather than through any triumphant confrontation. And there is, it turns out, a genuine difference between being proven innocent and getting the satisfying movie moment where everyone gasps and the villain is dragged away in disgrace. And real life, most of the take, only ever gives you the first one. Principal Tanaka called me into her office that same Friday afternoon, my parents rushing over again, and this time her face, when I walked in, had a different quality to it entirely, something closer to relief than caution. And she told me, plainly, that between the recovered chat logs and the technical analysis Sage and I had submitted, the school considered the matter resolved, that I was cleared, fully, and that Adam Hughes and his family had already been called in separately that morning. Coach Harrison found me at practice that same afternoon, before I'd even had a chance to process the news properly, and pulled me aside the exact same way he had weeks earlier to bench me, arms crossed, same steady, unreadable expression. And for one disorienting second, I braced myself for some new complication, before he said plainly, "You're starting Saturday, and I want you to know I never once thought you'd actually said any of that garbage. Benching you was never about believing it. It was about protecting you from a locker room that hadn't caught up to the truth yet. And I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to actually arrive." I told him I understood, and mostly I did, though it took me a while longer to fully separate the caution from the accusation in my own head. And he clapped me once on the shoulder, gruff and brief in the way he does everything, and said, for what it's worth, "That Romero kid, tell her if she ever wants to break down game film with that same level of detail, I've got a spot for her on the analytics side," only half joking. And I laughed and told him I'd pass it along, and did, that same night. And Sage laughed so hard she nearly choked on her dinner, saying, "Tell your coach I appreciate the offer, but I've already got a client," gesturing at me. And he doesn't even pay me in anything but gratitude and the occasional gas station snack. She didn't tell me exactly what happened in that meeting, privacy rules being what they are, but I heard, through the same slow, second-hand grapevine that had delivered every other piece of this story, that Adam had reportedly broken down almost immediately once confronted with his own recovered messages, unable to keep denying something with his own name and timestamp still attached to the original, undoctored version, and that his parents, already strained thin by their own divorce, had sat through the whole meeting looking, according to one office aide who witnessed part of it, less angry than simply exhausted. The specific exhaustion of parents watching their kid's worst moment collide with everything else already falling apart in their lives. I want to be honest that when I first heard he'd been suspended for 2 weeks and stripped of eligibility for the captain vote entirely, some old, understandably vindictive part of me felt a flash of pure satisfaction. The specific taste of finally watching consequences land exactly where they belonged after 2 weeks of watching them land everywhere except there. But that satisfaction didn't last as long as I expected it to, fading fast into something more complicated once I actually saw Adam in the hallway the following week, moving through school with none of his usual easy confidence, eyes down, shoulders in, looking, more than anything, like a kid who'd made one panicked, ugly decision under real pressure and had no idea yet how to live inside the wreckage of it. I want to say that once the truth came out, everything simply cleanly reversed itself. That the same hallway that had gone quiet around me 2 weeks earlier suddenly filled back up with warmth and apology, And in a way, for me specifically, that's mostly what happened. Kids who'd avoided eye contact now stopping to say, genuinely, "Hey man, that's rough. Glad it worked out." Ethan rejoining our lunch table within days with an apology so thorough and so clearly uncomfortable for him to deliver that I actually felt bad watching him squirm through it. He found me before school, actually, not at lunch where everyone could watch, which I think was deliberate on his part, and said without any preamble, "Look, I've been rehearsing this in my head for 2 days and I still don't have a good way to say it, so I'm just going to say it badly. I abandoned you when you needed people the most, and I told myself it was about staying safe. But honestly, it was about staying comfortable, and those aren't the same thing. And I'm sorry, and I understand if it takes you a while to actually believe that." And I stood there for a second just looking at him, feeling the specific, complicated mix of relief and lingering hurt that I imagine most people feel when an apology arrives late but genuinely meant. And I said, "Honestly, it's going to take me a minute, not because I don't believe you, but because it actually happened, and pretending it didn't sting isn't fair to either of us." And he nodded, like that was exactly the answer he'd braced himself for, and said, "Take whatever time you need, I'll still be here." And over the following weeks, he was, showing up consistently, small and steady, never asking to be forgiven faster than the hurt actually allowed, which I think in the end was the thing that actually rebuilt something real between us. Not the apology itself, but everything after it. Around that same time, even Zoe's careful hedging finally relaxed into something unguarded again. But somewhere in the retelling of the whole story, the way stories do in a school this size, the specific role Sage had played started to warp a little at the edges, and by the following week I began noticing a strange, uncomfortable new undercurrent, not aimed at me this time, but at her. It started small, the way these things always seem to. A comment I overheard in the hallway between 2 girls I barely knew. Something like, "Isn't it kind of weird that she was the one who just happened to know exactly how to prove it was fake? Like, how convenient." And I brushed it off at first as one stray, thoughtless remark, until Sage herself mentioned, quietly, over lunch that Thursday, that she'd started getting messages. Not many, but enough, from a handful of accounts she didn't recognize. Some just probing, genuinely curious, but a few sharper, more pointed. One asking outright whether she'd helped Adam build the original fake and then swooped in to fake solve it herself for attention. A theory that made absolutely no logical sense if you thought about it for more than 4 seconds, since Sage had nothing to gain and Adam had never once shown any sign of even liking her. But logic, I was learning fast, has never been the actual currency that rumors run on. It got worse once word spread, as it inevitably did, that Sage's proof had specifically been what convinced Principal Tanaka to formally investigate, and that a certain remaining pocket of Adam's old friend group, guys who'd been closest to him, who felt his punishment was unfair, or at least felt loyal enough to him personally to need somewhere to direct their anger that wasn't quite Adam himself, started, quietly at first, then less quietly, referring to Sage as the snitch, a word that traveled through our grade with the specific, ugly velocity that word always has, painting her, in the retelling, not as someone who'd helped uncover a genuine wrong, but as someone who'd taken pleasure in destroying a well-liked guy's future over what they characterized, absurdly, as basically a joke that got out of hand. I watched it build over the course of about a week and a half, with a rising, specific horror, because I recognized the shape of it instantly, having lived inside that exact shape myself only a month earlier. The sideways glances, the group chats she wasn't in anymore getting quieter whenever she walked past. A cruel, anonymous account that surfaced briefly on one of the school's meme pages, posting a blurry photo of her at her locker with a caption calling her a friendless narc who probably faked evidence just to matter to somebody for once. A sentence that, when Sage showed it to me, her hands slightly unsteady holding the phone, hit me with a force that made me genuinely furious in a way I hadn't even fully allowed myself to be on my own behalf. It escalated once, in person, in a way that still makes my jaw tighten to remember, when one of Adam's closest friends, a broad-shouldered senior named Brandon, who I'd always gotten along fine with before all this, cornered Sage by her own locker between 3rd and 4th period, not shouting, which somehow made it worse, just standing too close and saying, low and pointed, in a voice clearly meant to be heard by exactly one person, "You know what you did to him, right? You do realize his whole future's basically over because you needed to feel important for once. And Sage, by her own account when she told me about it later that day, had stood there frozen for a few seconds, all her usual calm, technical composure evaporating under the sheer physical intimidation of a much bigger kid standing that close with that much anger behind his voice, before finally managing to say, quietly, "I didn't do anything to him. He did it to himself." And walking away with her hands shaking so badly, she dropped her books twice before reaching her next class. I found out about it from Zoe, who'd seen the tail end of it from down the hallway and come find me between classes, practically vibrating with her own anger on Sage's behalf. And I want to be honest that the version of me who heard that story felt something close to the specific, focused fury I'd only otherwise felt reading that cruel caption on the meme page. And my first instinct, embarrassingly, was to go find Brandon myself and handle it the way 16-year-old boys instinctively want to handle things, which is to say, badly, loudly, and probably with my fists. And it was Sage herself, tracking me down at lunch and physically putting a hand on my arm before I could storm off toward the senior hallway, who talked me down, saying, quietly but firmly, "If you go fight him, you become the story again, and the story stops being about what actually happened and starts being about you losing your temper. Please, just let me handle this the way I know how to handle things." What she actually did instead was walk directly to Mr. Jenkins's office that same afternoon and report the encounter formally, calmly, with the same precise, factual clarity she brought to everything else, describing exactly what was said and exactly how it made her feel unsafe in her own hallway. And Mr. Jenkins, already primed by everything the school had been through that fall, took it seriously enough that Brandon found himself in a formal meeting with Tanaka by the end of the day, receiving a suspension of his own for the intimidation, a consequence that, once word spread, did more to quiet the remaining whispers than almost anything else that happened that whole month, because it made unmistakably clear, in a way that abstract policy language never quite manages to, that this particular kind of retaliation actually had teeth now. Sage, true to the person I'd come to know over the past month, didn't want to make a big thing of it at first, insisting, in the same calm, careful voice she'd used to walk me through font-kerning weeks earlier, that it would blow over, that people had short memories, that she'd survived 2 years of being ignored and could certainly survive a week or two of being talked about instead. But I could see, underneath the composure, that this was landing somewhere much deeper than she wanted to admit, because being ignored, however lonely, had at least been safe. And this was the first time in longer perhaps she could probably remember that being noticed had actually hurt. She stopped coming to the antique shop with her usual energy that week, Ingrid mentioning to me quietly, when I stopped by on my own one afternoon looking for Sage and finding her not there, that her granddaughter had called in sick to her Saturday shift for the first time in over a year, which told me, more than anything Sage herself would have admitted out loud, exactly how much weight she was actually carrying. I found her that same afternoon, not at the shop and not answering texts, and eventually just went to her house, something I'd never done before. And her mother, a tired-looking woman who worked, Sage had mentioned once, long hospital shifts, let me in with a small, grateful nod, like she'd been hoping someone would show up. And I found Sage in her room, headphones on, not actually listening to anything, just sitting very still on her bed with her laptop closed for once. An image so unlike the confident, absorbed girl I'd watched sort antique photographs 3 weeks earlier that it stopped me in the doorway for a second before I said anything at all. I sat down on the floor across from her, not the bed, some instinct telling me that mattered, and said, "You don't have to pretend this doesn't hurt just because you're the one who's usually taking care of everyone else." And she looked at me for a long moment, something in her face cracking slightly, and said quietly, "I spent 2 years figuring out how to be invisible enough that nothing like this could ever happen to me. And I broke my own rule for you. And now I'm finding out the rule existed for a reason. And I didn't have a clean, reassuring answer to that because it was true. And reassuring lies felt like exactly the wrong thing to offer someone who'd just spent an entire conversation with me proving how much she valued the truth over comfort. So instead I just said, I know. And I'm not going to pretend I can fix this by myself, but I promise you're not doing the rest of it alone. The same thing you told me a month ago, and I mean it exactly as much as you did. The opportunity to actually do something about it arrived sooner than I expected, in the form of the fall sports banquet. an annual Ridgeview tradition held in the auditorium every November, open to the whole school and most of the parents, where every team got recognized, awards got handed out, and most relevantly that particular year, the varsity soccer captain for the coming season got formally announced. A vote that had, with Adam disqualified and suspended, come down clearly and decisively in my favor once the team recast their ballots the week before. Coach Harrison told me 2 days ahead of time that I'd be expected to say a few words after the announcement. The standard, brief captain's remarks that every previous captain had given. A few sentences about the team, about the season ahead. Nothing complicated. And I spent those 2 days turning something over in my head that I hadn't said out loud yet to anyone, not even Sage, because I wasn't sure yet whether I had the nerve to actually do it. The auditorium that night was packed. Parents in the folding chairs. Students crowded into the back rows, more interested in getting out of study hall than in athletic awards. And I sat in the front section with the rest of the team, watching Sage 3 rows back with her mother and Ingrid, both of whom had come specifically to support her, even though tonight had nothing officially to do with her at all, looking small and uncomfortable in the specific way she'd looked ever since the whispers started, clearly having debated with herself all week about whether even showing up tonight was worth the risk of being stared at. When Coach Harrison called my name for captain, the applause was warm, genuine. Exactly the kind of moment I would have been thrilled by a month earlier without any complications attached to it. And I walked up to that small podium with my heart going harder than it ever had before a single soccer match in my life, because the speech in my head wasn't the one anyone in that room was expecting. I thanked the team briefly, thanked Coach Harrison, hit the 2 or 3 standard sentences everyone half expects at these things, and then, instead of stepping down, I stayed at that microphone a moment longer and said, "Actually, before I sit down, there's something else I want to say." And I could feel the room's attention sharpen slightly, the specific quality of an audience sensing an unscripted moment about to happen. I said, "Most of you know some version of what happened to me last month. A fake screenshot, a couple of terrible weeks. And I know a lot of you have already heard that it got sorted out, that the person responsible was found and it wasn't me. And I'm grateful for that, genuinely. But what most of you don't know, because it never got announced from any stage, is the actual reason any of that got sorted out at all, which is that one specific person in this school looked at that screenshot when literally everyone else had already made up their minds. And instead of joining in, she spent hours of her own time proving, with actual technical evidence, that it was fake. And she did that for someone who, and I want to be honest about this part in front of all of you, had never really been a friend to her before. Had in fact once brushed off her ideas without even noticing he was doing it. And she helped me anyway, because she said it wasn't right, watching someone get erased, whether or not she liked them personally. I looked out at Sage 3 rows back, her face doing something complicated, somewhere between horror at being singled out and something else entirely underneath it. And I said, "Some people in this school have decided to call her a snitch for that, have made the last 2 weeks of her life genuinely difficult for the crime of caring enough to tell the truth when it would have been so much easier not to. And I want to say, clearly, in front of everyone, that Sage Romero is the actual reason I'm standing at this podium tonight, instead of still being the guy everyone crossed the hallway to avoid. And if this school has room to applaud me for a game-winning goal, it has room to say her name out loud for something that mattered a whole lot more than that ever will." There was a beat of genuine silence after I said it, the specific hush of an auditorium recalibrating in real time. And then, somewhere in the middle section, I heard Ingrid's voice, unmistakable, sharp and proud, calling out, "That's my granddaughter," before anyone else had a chance to react, which broke the tension just enough that the applause that followed came in fast and warm, and, importantly, loud. Not the polite, scattered clapping of an audience being dutiful, but something closer to what I'd gotten for making captain. Kids standing up in the back rows, Zoe practically vaulting out of her seat, and I saw Sage, 3 rows back, bury her face briefly in her hands before her mother pulled her into a hug so fierce I could see it from the stage. And when she finally looked up again, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling, really smiling, in a way I hadn't seen from her since that afternoon in the antique shop weeks earlier. I found her afterward in the crowded lobby, surrounded by people, actual strangers to her, coming up to say some version of, "Hey, that was really cool what you did," or, "I didn't know that was you, that's amazing." A strange, sudden little swell of visibility that I could tell she didn't quite know what to do with yet. And when she finally broke free enough to reach me, she didn't say thank you. She just looked at me for a long moment and said, "You didn't have to do that." And I said, "Yeah, I did, actually." And she said, "You could have just quietly told people. You didn't have to make it a whole speech in front of the entire school." And I said, "I know, but you did the quiet version for me, and I watched what quiet costs when nobody else knows to give you credit for it. So I figured this time it should be loud." And Sage, looking at me with an expression I hadn't quite seen from her before, said quietly, "Nobody's ever done something like that for me." And I said, "Well, get used to it, because I'm planning on being annoying about it for the foreseeable future," which finally, blessedly, made her laugh. The snitch narrative didn't survive the week after that banquet, not because anyone issued a formal correction, but because it's genuinely hard to keep calling someone a bitter, attention-seeking tattletale once the school's own starting captain has stood up on a stage in front of everyone's parents and called them the reason he got his life back. And I watched, with a satisfaction that felt entirely different from the earlier flash of vindictiveness over Adam's suspension, as the whole ugly framing simply lost its grip on people, one hallway conversation at a time. The same anonymous meme account that had posted that cruel photo of Sage quietly taking it down within 2 days once the comments underneath it turned hostile toward the account itself instead of her. Alex Reyes, the freshman whose real hurt had accidentally cracked the whole case open, came and found me at practice about a week later, hovering awkwardly at the edge of the field until I waved him over, and he told me, in the halting, careful way freshmen talk to varsity players they don't know well, that he'd wanted to apologize. For what exactly he wasn't entirely sure, since none of it had actually been his fault. And I told him that clearly that he had nothing to apologize for. That if anything, I owed him something, since his own hard week had ended up being the thread that unraveled the whole thing. And he looked relieved in a way that suggested he'd been carrying some quiet, misplaced guilt about it for days. I made a point after that of actually getting to know him properly, the way I never had before all this happened, and found out he was a genuinely funny kid once he stopped being nervous around upperclassmen, sharp on the field in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's cleats or anyone's finances, and by the time spring tryouts rolled around, he'd earned himself a real look at varsity minutes on merit alone, which felt, watching it happen, like a small, quiet correction to something that had started as pure cruelty and ended somewhere much better than it had any right to. Adam's story didn't get a clean bow on it, and I think that's honest to include rather than smooth over. He served his suspension, lost the eligibility he'd been chasing since freshman year, and came back to school afterward changed in a way that was hard to watch. Quieter, smaller, clearly carrying the specific, isolating weight of being the person everyone now knew the real story about. I didn't become friends with him again. That particular bridge felt, and still feels, too far gone to rebuild. But I did have one conversation with him, about a month after the banquet, when we ended up alone in the equipment room at the same time, and the silence got too heavy for either of us to just keep ignoring, and he said, without quite looking at me for what it's worth, "I know sorry doesn't undo any of it, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it once directly, instead of hiding from you in hallways." And I told him honestly that I appreciated him saying it, that I didn't hate him exactly, but that trust wasn't something I had left to offer him right now. And he nodded, like that was exactly the answer he'd expected and probably deserved, and said, "That's fair," and we didn't talk much after that. Not out of lingering hostility, just the quiet, mutual understanding of two people who both know a particular door has closed for good reason. I ran into his mother once, purely by accident, at the grocery store the summer after graduation, and she recognized me before I recognized her, saying my name softly across the cereal aisle, and I could see her bracing for me to be cold or to just walk away. And instead I asked, honestly, how Adam was doing, and she told me, with a tired but genuine smile, that he'd finished the year at his new school, made the soccer team there too, and seemed, in her careful words, like he was slowly remembering how to like himself again. And she said, "Thank you for asking, most people don't. They just remember the worst thing." And I told her that I hoped that kept being true for him, that I meant it, and she nodded, and we went our separate ways down our separate aisles, and I stood there for a second afterward, thinking about how strange and unglamorous real forgiveness actually is. Not a dramatic scene, not a tearful reconciliation, just one honest question asked across a cereal aisle, and the quiet relief on a tired mother's face at being asked it at all. Principal Tanaka, to her credit, didn't just let the whole incident quietly fade into school legend once the immediate crisis passed. She called an all-staff meeting that same month, Mr. Jenkins mentioned to me later, specifically about how quickly an unverified image had been allowed to spread through the school's own culture before any adult had a real process for questioning it. And by January, the district had actually adopted a small but meaningful new policy, a designated staff contact. Mr. Jenkins himself, as it turned out, specifically trained and authorized to receive and triage exactly this kind of digital evidence dispute, so that the next kid this happened to, and Tanaka said grimly, in a follow-up conversation my mother told me about afterward, that she had no illusions this was the last time it would happen, wouldn't have to rely on a lucky coincidence of one classmate's antique shop hobby to get taken seriously. By the following fall, that new policy had grown into something a little more permanent. A small, student-run peer group Mr. Jenkins helped organize called the Verification Club, of all things. A name Sage picked specifically because she said it sounded boring enough that nobody would assume it was some kind of clique. A handful of students trained in basic media literacy and digital evidence basics, who other kids could quietly approach whenever something felt off before it spiraled into a full-blown crisis the way ours had. And Sage, despite already having graduated by the time it fully got off the ground, still came back once a semester for the first 2 years to guest teach the founding members everything she knew, treating it, in her words, like handing off a business she genuinely cared about to people who'd actually keep it running honestly. The first genuinely normal weekend we all had together, after everything settled down, happened in late November, about 2 weeks after the banquet, when Zoe declared, with the specific bossy confidence she gets when she's decided something is happening, whether anyone objects or not, that we were all going bowling on Saturday. No discussion. Because in her exact words, we have spent an entire semester being a support group, and I would like, one time, for us to just be idiots together with no crisis attached to it. Ethan paid for the first round of games as a kind of unspoken penance he'd been quietly working through for weeks. Alex Reyes showed up despite being the youngest of the group by 2 years, invited by Aisha, who by then had become close enough with all of us that leaving her out would have felt wrong. And Sage, who confessed on the car ride over that she had never actually been bowling in her life, turned out to be spectacularly, hilariously bad at it, her ball finding the gutter with such reliable, comic precision that by the third frame the whole lane was cheering ironically every time she managed to knock down even one pin. And she laughed so hard at her own incompetence that she had to sit down on the plastic bench and catch her breath, wiping actual tears from her eyes. And I remember thinking, watching her double over laughing surrounded by 5 people who'd all, in their own ways, shown up for both of us that fall, that this, more than the banquet speech, more than any dramatic reveal, was the actual reward for everything we'd survived. Just an ordinary, loud, slightly ridiculous Saturday night with people who genuinely liked being around each other. No screenshots, no investigations, no cruelty humming underneath any of it. Just 6 teenagers eating bad nachos and cheering for a gutter ball like it was an Olympic event. Sage heard back from the regional science fair in early December, a thick envelope arriving at her house on a Tuesday that she texted me a photo of before she'd even opened it. And I dropped what I was doing and drove over immediately, sitting on her front steps while she read it, her hands genuinely shaking in a way I hadn't seen since that first day by the water fountain. And when she finally looked up, her expression somewhere between disbelief and pure shock, she said, "I got in. First round. They want me to present at regionals in February." And I actually picked her up off the steps in a hug that made Ingrid, watching from the shop next door where she happened to be visiting, holler something in a language I didn't recognize that Sage later translated, laughing, as roughly, "That's my girl, obviously. What did you expect?" She spent the next 2 months refining the project further, expanding her original proposal into something more ambitious, once one of the judges, a genuinely renowned digital forensics researcher who happened to be reviewing regional submissions, reached out personally with feedback, suggesting she incorporate a broader data set of manipulated versus authentic images to strengthen her methodology. And I want to be honest that watching Sage work during those 2 months, fully absorbed, fully confident, occasionally staying up embarrassingly late, texting me screenshots of some new detection technique she'd just figured out, was one of the best parts of that entire winter. A specific, quiet joy in watching someone finally get to be as good at something in public as she'd always secretly been in private. It was during that same stretch, in late January, that the two of us ended up putting Sage's whole skill set to use again. This time for someone else entirely, when a sophomore named Aisha Sharma, a girl neither of us knew particularly well outside of a shared study hall, got accused, based on a supposedly leaked screenshot, of having cheated on a chemistry final by texting answers to a friend during the test. A story that spread through the sophomore grade with the same ugly speed ours had. Teachers already discussing potential academic consequences before anyone had actually verified anything. I recognized the shape of it instantly, that specific sickening speed of a reputation collapsing overnight, and mentioned it to Sage almost as an afterthought over lunch. And she went very quiet for a second, then said, "Send me the screenshot, let me look at it." And within 20 minutes, examining a photo Aisha's own terrified younger brother had forwarded to a mutual friend, Sage had found the exact same kind of tell she'd spotted in mine. A compression artifact around the edges of the supposed text bubble that only shows up when an image has been edited and resaved multiple times. Evidence that this, too, was almost certainly manufactured rather than real. We brought it straight to Mr. Jenkins this time. No note-passing mystery, no anonymous mid-note drama. Just walked into his office together after school and laid it out plainly. And he took it seriously immediately, given everything the school had already been through that fall, pulling in the actual chemistry teacher, and within 2 days, confirming through the testing software's own login records that Aisha had never once accessed any test-sharing platform during the exam window, that the entire screenshot had been fabricated by a classmate nursing an unrelated grudge over a broken friendship from middle school. Aisha cried in the hallway when she found out she'd been cleared, hugging Sage so hard she nearly knocked her over, and said, through actual tears, "I heard what happened to you guys in the fall. I didn't think anyone would actually believe me over a screenshot." And Sage, looking briefly, genuinely moved, said, "That's exactly why we came to find you the second we heard. Because I know exactly what it feels like to need someone to believe you before you can even prove it yourself." The regional science fair happened that February in the gymnasium of a much bigger school across the county. Rows of trifold display boards and nervous students in their best clothes. And I showed up with Ingrid and Sage's mother, both of them having taken the entire afternoon off specifically for this, and found Sage standing at her booth in a blazer she'd clearly borrowed from somewhere, looking more nervous than I'd seen her since the day I first read her note by the library, running through her opening lines under her breath one more time before the judges made their way over. I watched from a respectful distance as 3 separate judging panels stopped at her table over the course of that afternoon, and each time I watched the same transformation happen. The nervous fidgeting falling away the second someone asked her an actual technical question, her voice steadying, gaining speed and confidence as she walked them through font kerning and compression artifacts and metadata timestamps with the exact same patient clarity she'd once used to save my entire reputation on a concrete wall outside our school library. She placed second overall in the technology category, losing only to a genuinely staggering solar panel efficiency project from a magnet school 2 counties over. And when they announced her name for the runner-up ribbon, Ingrid let out a whoop loud enough that half the gymnasium turned to look, entirely unbothered by the attention. And Sage, walking back from the podium with the ribbon in her hand, found me in the crowd first, before her own mother even, and said breathless, still processing it, "I actually did it." And I said, "I told you the judges were going to lose their minds." And she said, "You said blow their minds," slightly different phrasing. And I said, "Same energy." And she laughed. That same full, surprised laugh I'd first heard weeks earlier over a joke about her own antique shop expertise. A laugh that, by that point in the year, had become one of my favorite sounds in the entire world. Spring soccer season arrived with its own strange new pressure. My first full season as captain, a title that had come to me under circumstances I never would have wished for on myself or anyone else, but one I found myself determined to actually earn properly rather than just inherit by default. And I spent a lot of that season thinking, more than I ever had before, about what kind of captain I actually wanted to be. Not just tactically, but in the smaller, quieter ways, making sure the newer JV call-ups, guys like Alex Reyes, who made varsity for real that spring on pure merit, never once felt the way I imagine he must have felt during those 2 ugly weeks in the fall, invisible until he was useful as a punchline. I want to tell you about the specific afternoon that made all of that effort feel worth it. A home game in late April against our biggest regional rival, tied at 1 goal apiece with maybe 10 minutes left on the clock, when I found Alex wide open on the left side, a pass I almost didn't make out of pure habit since he was still the new guy in most of the team's unconscious muscle memory, and something made me send it to him anyway, and he settled it first touch and buried it top corner from 20 yards out. A genuinely gorgeous strike that sent our entire home side into chaos. And I remember sprinting over to him, the rest of the team piling on right behind me, and Alex standing there in the middle of that pile, grinning so hard it looked like it might actually hurt, shouting over the noise, "Did you see that? Did you actually see that?" And I shouted back, "I set it up. Obviously I saw it." And he laughed. And later, after the game, walking off the field still catching his breath, he told me quietly that it was the first time all year he'd felt like just a soccer player instead of the scholarship kid or the kid from the screenshot or any of the other labels that had attached themselves to him without his permission, just a guy who'd scored a great goal in a game that mattered. And I told him honestly, that's exactly what you've always been. It just took the rest of us a while to catch up to seeing it that clearly, and he didn't say anything back, just bumped his fist against mine. But I could tell it landed exactly the way I meant it to. I made a point, without ever making a speech about it, of pairing Alex with our most patient upperclassmen for drills, of asking his opinion out loud during team meetings the same way I ask anyone else's. Small things that cost me nothing and seemed, watching him over the following months, to matter more to him than I expected. Until one afternoon after a particularly good practice he told me, a little shyly, that being captain suited me. That I made the locker room feel less like a hierarchy and more like an actual team, which is, I'll admit, the best compliment anyone gave me that entire year, better even than the captaincy itself. Sage's own transformation over that spring was, if anything, even more dramatic than mine, because a girl who had spent 2 full years eating lunch alone in the library found herself, almost overnight, in genuine demand, not in some shallow novelty way, but because word had spread, accurately this time, that she was smart, funny once you got past the initial quiet, and fiercely loyal to anyone she decided was worth her time. And by spring, she'd joined the school's small robotics club, at Mr. Jenkins's gentle suggestion, discovering a whole new circle of similarly quiet, similarly brilliant kids who'd apparently been operating in their own parallel social world the entire time. One Sage had simply never had a bridge into before. She started that spring sitting with us at lunch maybe half the time, and with her new robotics friends the other half, a splitting of her attention that I initially worried might mean drifting apart, until she caught me looking a little forlorn about it one day and said, bluntly, in the specific way she always cut straight to the point, "You're not losing me. I just finally have enough people that I don't need to spend all of my social battery on one table," which is honestly the healthiest thing either of us learned that whole year. And I told her exactly that, and she said, "Look at you, getting emotionally mature." And I said, "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to protect." And she said, "Too late. I already told Ingrid." And Ingrid apparently told the entire regular customer base of the antique shop, so it's basically public record now. Our friend group by that point had settled into something wide and sturdy in a way I couldn't have imagined during those first miserable 19 hours. Zoe and Ethan both fully back in the fold, Alex Reyes occasionally tagging along once soccer season wound down, even Aisha Sharma, the sophomore we'd helped clear that winter, becoming enough of a fixture that by May, nobody at our table could quite remember a version of it without her in it. And I remember sitting outside at a table during an unseasonably warm afternoon in late spring, surrounded by all of them, arguing about absolutely nothing important, and thinking, with a specific, quiet gratitude I hadn't fully expected to feel about any of this, that the worst month of my entire life had somehow, against every possible prediction, built me the best group of people I'd ever had. That summer brought its own small test of everything we'd built, when Sage got accepted into a competitive 6-week digital forensics and cybersecurity camp at a university 2 states away. An opportunity she initially almost turned down out of the same old instinct to shrink herself smaller than she actually was. Worried, she admitted to me the night before the deadline, that 6 weeks away from everyone who'd finally started treating her like she belonged somewhere might mean coming back to find that belonging had quietly evaporated in her absence. I told her honestly that I understood the fear, but that it was exactly backwards. That the whole point of everything that had happened that year was proving that real friendship travels further than 6 weeks and a few states. And if she turned down something this good out of fear that people like me were that flimsy, I was going to be genuinely offended on behalf of my own loyalty. She went in the end, and true to the promise I'd made her, she texted constantly, and I texted back just as much. And by the time she came home in August, tanned and talking a mile a minute about some encryption challenge she'd apparently solved faster than anyone else in her cohort, it was immediately, obviously clear that nothing important had shifted at all. That Ingrid's shop still smelled like dust and old paper. That our lunch table was still exactly as loud and ridiculous as she'd left it. That the specific, easy rhythm between the two of us had simply been waiting, patiently, for her to come back into it, rather than eroding in her absence the way she'd feared. I spent that same summer working at my dad's hardware store and running informal soccer clinics for younger kids in the neighborhood, a thing Coach Harrison had actually suggested to me, half joking, half serious, that a captain who genuinely cared about mentoring younger players should probably start practicing on actual younger players. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I loved it. Watching a scrappy group of 10 and 11-year-olds slowly get less scared of the ball, less scared of messing up in front of each other, and more than once, watching some shy kid on the sidelines finally get talked into joining a drill by one of his more confident teammates. I thought about Sage on that concrete wall outside the library, about how much of the last year had really just been one long lesson in exactly how much difference it makes when somebody decides to make room for you instead of just noticing you exist. Senior year started that August with a version of Ridgeview that felt walking through the doors again, quietly but definitely different from the school I'd walked into a year earlier, bracing for a second wave of hallway silence. Adam, having transferred at his parents' request to a school across the district for what everyone assumed, correctly, was a fresh start he genuinely needed, wasn't there at all. A fact that landed on me with more complicated feelings than I expected. Less satisfaction than a kind of quiet, unresolved sadness for a kid whose worst moment had ended up costing him so much more than it needed to, if only he'd found some other way to handle whatever he'd been carrying that fall. Sage, meanwhile, walked those same hallways that September, looking like an entirely different person than the girl who'd once kept her headphones in at all times as a kind of armor, stopping every few feet to talk to someone from robotics club, or from the friend group that had assembled itself the year before, or, increasingly, just to people who'd simply started recognizing her and liking her on her own straightforward terms. And I remember walking a few steps behind her that first morning, watching her navigate a crowded hallway with an ease I never would have predicted a year earlier, and feeling a small, private swell of pride that had nothing to do with anything I'd personally accomplished. We decided that fall, somewhat impulsively, to enter a joint project into the same regional Young Innovators showcase Sage had done solo the year before. This time combining her forensics work with my own newfound, entirely unexpected interest in sports analytics, something I'd stumbled into that summer running youth clinics, tracking simple movement patterns and decision-making data from the kids I coached, and finding it, to my own genuine surprise, fascinating in a way that had nothing to do with soccer glory and everything to do with just how much invisible structure sits underneath something as simple as a kid deciding which way to pass a ball. We built a project analyzing decision-making speed under social pressure, using footage from actual youth games alongside Sage's own frame-by-frame verification techniques to measure hesitation patterns in young athletes who'd been publicly criticized during a match versus those who hadn't. A project that grew, almost accidentally, into something neither of us fully anticipated. A genuinely rigorous piece of research into exactly how public shame measurably slows down a person's ability to think clearly under pressure, built by two people who, between the two of us, had lived through more relevant first-hand data than either of us particularly wanted to admit out loud during the actual presentation. We placed first that year, no second place this time, the judges specifically praising what one of them called, in her written feedback, an unusually mature and personally grounded approach to a technical subject. And standing backstage afterward, holding the winning ribbon together, Sage looked at me and said, "You know, we basically just wrote our own origin story into a science project." And I said, "Yeah, I noticed that about halfway through." And she said, "Is that weird?" And I said, "No, I think it's actually kind of perfect." And she smiled and didn't argue. The rest of senior year moved the way senior years apparently always do. Faster than feels fair, college applications, and one genuinely excellent final soccer season that ended in the conference semifinals, close enough to a title that the whole team still talks about the missed call in the final 5 minutes, and Sage's own applications landing her, by March, an acceptance into exactly the kind of computer science and digital forensics program she'd been quietly building toward since that very first afternoon in her grandmother's back room. A specific, focused ambition that had existed the whole time, waiting only for someone to actually ask her about it properly. Graduation arrived on a warm June evening, the specific golden light that seems to show up at every graduation everywhere, as if the universe has a standing arrangement about it. Folding chairs set up on the football field, families packed into the bleachers, and I want to describe the one moment from that whole ceremony that mattered most to me, which happened, fittingly, not during any of the official parts. Right before we lined up alphabetically to process onto the field, Sage found me in the crowd of green and gold gowns, pushing through a cluster of classmates to reach me, and pressed something small into my hand. And when I opened my palm, I found, framed in a thin, simple black border she'd clearly bought specifically for this, the actual original folded note, the very first one, worn soft at the creases from 2 years of sitting in my desk drawer where I'd kept it. The 4 sentences that had started everything. "The screenshot is fake. I can prove it. Meet me by the library after school. Don't tell anyone yet. Now preserved permanently under glass." And on the back of the frame, in her same small, careful handwriting, it said, "Some notes are worth keeping forever. Thank you for actually showing up that day." I didn't trust myself to say anything smooth in response to that, standing in a crush of soon-to-be graduates with my throat suddenly tight. So I just hugged her, hard, right there in the chaos. And she said, into the hug, laughing a little, "Okay, you're going to make me cry before we even process. Pull it together, Miller." And I said, "That's rich coming from the girl who just handed me a framed piece of evidence like it's a sentimental keepsake." And she said, "It is a sentimental keepsake. It's just also, technically, still evidence. I contain multitudes." Which made both of us laugh hard enough that Zoe, lining up nearby, demanded to know what was so funny, and neither of us could quite explain it in a way that did the moment justice. So we just said, "It's a long story," and left it at that. The ceremony itself passed in the specific blur that I think everyone's graduation passes in. Names called out one after another, polite applause rippling through the bleachers, until they reached the C's and called Sage Romero, and I watched from my spot several rows back as she crossed that stage, and the applause that came up for her from our particular section of the crowd, our whole tangled friend group, Zoe and Ethan and Alex and Aisha, all cheering loud enough to be genuinely embarrassing, was, I'm fairly sure, louder than almost anyone else got that whole ceremony. Loud enough that she visibly had to fight down a laugh crossing the stage, shooting us one quick, delighted glance before accepting her diploma. When they finally called my own name a few minutes later, I heard distinctly, over the general applause, Ingrid's unmistakable voice again, exactly as sharp and unbothered as it had been at the sports banquet 2 years earlier, hollering something enthusiastic in that same accent I still couldn't quite place. And I walked off that stage grinning too hard to properly listen to whatever the principal said to me on the way past. Afterward, out on the football field in the golden early evening light, both our families found each other almost immediately in the crowd, the way they always seemed to by that point. 3 full years of dinners and holidays and quiet, accumulated closeness between 2 households that had started as virtual strangers and ended up feeling like one extended, slightly chaotic unit. My mother and Sage's mother hugging like old friends. My dad enthusiastically shaking Ingrid's hand while she said something to him that made him laugh so hard he had to take his glasses off. And Sage and I standing slightly apart from the group photos for a moment, both of us still in our gowns, looking out at a football field full of families and mortarboards and the exact same golden light that seemed determined to make this whole ordinary field look like something out of a movie. She said quietly, "Do you remember the fifth period study hall when I passed you that note?" And I said, "Obviously, I have it literally in my hand right now." And she laughed and said, "I almost didn't do it, you know. I sat there for like 10 minutes deciding whether it was worth the risk of you just ignoring me completely, or worse, thinking I was making the whole thing up to get attention." And I said, "I'm really glad you did it anyway." And she said, "Me too, obviously. Look what happened," and gestured a little helplessly at the entire chaotic, beloved crowd of people surrounding us. Both our families, our whole friend group, 3 years of accumulated proof that one small, brave, folded piece of paper had turned out to matter a great deal more than either of us could have possibly guessed, standing on opposite ends of that fifth period classroom. We moved out that August within a week of each other, Sage heading 6 hours west to the university with the digital forensics program she'd chosen specifically for its partnership with an actual regional cybercrime lab, and me heading 4 hours the other direction to a school with a solid enough athletic program and, more importantly by that point in my life, a genuinely excellent sports management and analytics track that I'd gotten quietly obsessed with ever since that youth coaching summer had turned into a full research project. We said goodbye in her driveway the weekend before move-in, both cars loaded down with the specific chaotic overflow of 18 years of accumulated belongings, and neither of us made a big speech about it, because by that point we both understood, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever this friendship actually was, it had already survived far worse tests than a few hours of highway, a fake screenshot, a wave of cruel rumors, an entire hostile hallway, and mere geography did not strike either of us as a particularly serious threat by comparison. She did, predictably, hand me one more small object before I got in the car, a habit that had become so established between us over 3 years that I'd started keeping an actual dedicated shoebox just for these. And this one, when I opened it once I was an hour down the highway, pulled over at a rest stop while my dad filled the tank, turned out to be a small printed card, the kind you'd get made at a novelty shop, styled exactly like an official verification report, complete with a fake letterhead that said, "Romero Forensics Services," and underneath, in her actual handwriting, a formal-looking certification that read, "Subject, Leo Miller, Friendship Status, Verified Authentic, No editing detected." And I laughed so hard in that rest stop parking lot that my dad came over to check I hadn't lost my mind entirely. College, that first semester, tested the actual substance of everything Ridgeview had taught me in a way I genuinely hadn't expected, because it turned out the specific machinery of unverified rumor, spreading faster than truth, doesn't stay behind in high school. It just changes venues. And about 6 weeks into my freshman year, I found myself sitting in my dorm's common room on a Tuesday night, doing homework with my roommate, when our floor's group chat exploded over an anonymous post accusing a quiet sophomore 2 doors down, a guy named Liam, who mostly kept to himself, of having stolen money from the floor's shared snack fund, a supposed screenshot of a bank transfer circulating as proof, timestamps and all, and half my floor already calling for him to be reported to housing before anyone had actually asked Liam a single direct question about any of it. I sat there feeling that old, specific cold drop in my stomach, immediate and unmistakable, the exact shape of something I recognized in my bones by now, and instead of just piling into the group chat with an opinion the way half the floor already had, I did the thing Sage had taught me without ever explicitly meaning to teach it. I typed, plainly, under my own name, "Hey, has anyone actually asked Liam about this? Or is everyone just assuming a screenshot means it's true? Because I've personally learned the hard way that screenshots can be faked pretty convincingly. Has anyone verified this with the actual bank or with housing yet?" The chat went quiet for a moment after that, the specific quiet of a group of people realizing, collectively, that nobody had actually done that basic check before deciding someone's guilt. And I texted Sage immediately afterward, mostly just to vent, but also, half joking, to ask if she wanted to consult, and she called me back within 2 minutes, genuinely delighted, saying, "Send me the screenshot, obviously, I missed this." And 20 minutes later, working purely off a photo I'd forwarded from 3 states away, she'd found it. A font inconsistency in the supposed bank app interface nearly identical to the exact kind of tell she'd spotted on my own case 2 years earlier. And I brought that straight to our resident advisor, who took it seriously enough to actually contact housing directly, and within a day it turned out, unsurprisingly at that point to either of us, that the transfer had never happened at all, fabricated entirely by a kid on our floor who'd had a petty grudge against Liam since orientation week over an argument about a parking spot. Liam, once it was resolved, found me at the dining hall a few days later. Awkward in the specific way people are when they're trying to thank you for something that embarrasses them to have needed at all, and said, "Hey, I heard you were the one who actually asked people to slow down before deciding I was a thief. Thank you, genuinely. Most people would have just piled on." And I told him honestly that I knew exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of that pile-on, and that I'd promised someone important to me a long time ago that I'd keep being the person who asks the question instead of just joining the crowd. And Liam said, "Well, whoever that someone is, they did a good job." And I said, "Yeah, she really did." And called Sage again that same night just to tell her the whole story properly, and she said, laughing, "We should genuinely start charging for this. Romero and Miller Forensics, verified friendship, verified innocence, one low consulting fee." And I said, "I'll design the letterhead." And she said, "I already made one. It's the fake one I gave you in the parking lot." And I said, "So we're already in business?" And she said, "Apparently we have been for 3 years. We just never billed anyone." I drove out to visit her college campus that same fall, a 6-hour trip I made specifically because she'd been talking for weeks about a forensics lab open house her department was hosting. Clearly proud of it in the understated way she gets proud of things. And I wanted to actually see the world she'd built for herself, rather than just hearing about it secondhand over the phone. Her new friends from the program, a small, tightly knit group of similarly quiet, similarly brilliant kids, who'd apparently found each other within the first month of freshman year, the way certain people always seem to find their exact right people once given half a chance, greeted me with a level of curiosity that made it clear Sage had told them at least some version of our story. One of them, a guy named Rishi, pulling me aside almost immediately to say, only half joking, "So you're the guy from the screenshot story. Sage mentioned you approximately 400 times during our forensics theory final. I feel like I know your entire personality already." Which made me laugh and made Sage, overhearing, turn faintly pink and threaten to revoke his lab access. Watching her present at that open house, walking a room of parents and prospective students through a case study she'd worked on that semester, confident, articulate, completely in her element, standing in front of a room instead of hiding at the edge of one, I felt a specific, quiet pride that had nothing to do with anything I'd contributed, and everything to do with simply having been lucky enough to watch this particular transformation happen up close. From a girl who once could barely accept a compliment without flinching, to a young woman commanding a room full of strangers with total, easy authority. Afterward, walking back to her dorm under a sky full of stars neither of us got to see much of back in our own smoggy hometown, she asked me quietly, "Does it ever feel strange to you how much of who I am now is built on top of the worst week of your life?" And I told her honestly that I'd thought about that exact question more than once. And the answer I'd landed on was that it wasn't built on top of my worst week. It was built on top of the choice she made during it, and those weren't the same foundation at all. The bad week was just the moment the choice happened to be necessary. And she looked at me for a long moment under that unfamiliar sky and said quietly, "I like that version better." And we walked the rest of the way back mostly in comfortable silence, the specific kind neither of us had ever needed to fill with anything more than just being there. College years have a way of blurring together faster than high school ever did, the specific accelerated rhythm of semesters stacking on top of each other. And I want to skip ahead through most of the ordinary parts, the classes, the internships, the slow, unglamorous accumulation of an actual adult life, and just tell you the parts that still mattered directly to this particular story. Sage landed an internship the summer after her sophomore year at the exact regional cybercrime lab her university partnered with, working, of all things, on a team that helped local school districts and small businesses verify digital evidence in exactly the kind of disputes that had once upended both our lives. And she called me the day she got the offer, dwindling with the specific joy of getting to do, professionally, the thing she'd once had to fight to be taken seriously for as a 16-year-old with a hobby, and said, "You know the actual reason I got this internship, more than the science fair stuff? was that one of the interviewers asked about a real case I'd worked, and I told them about you, about the whole thing. And they said it was the most compelling answer they'd heard all week. And I said, "So I'm basically your reference now." And she said, "You're my origin story. There's a difference." And I said, "That's an even better answer. You should have led with that." I spent my own college summers running an increasingly serious youth soccer analytics program back home. The same clinics I'd started the summer after junior year, having grown, almost accidentally, into a genuine small business by my junior year of college. Coaches from 3 different towns eventually asking me to help train their own staff on the decision pressure research Sage and I had built together senior year. And I found myself more than once standing in front of a room of adult coaches twice my age, explaining data I'd first started collecting because a 16-year-old me had needed to understand his own worst month well enough to turn it into something useful. We stayed close the entire 4 years, obviously, visiting each other over breaks, meeting up for a full week most summers, the specific kind of friendship that had simply stopped needing daily proximity to feel solid a long time before either of us left for college. And by senior year of college, Sage had already accepted a full-time position at that same cybercrime lab, moving, once she graduated, to an apartment only 40 minutes from where I'd settled to start my own first real job with a professional youth development league that had, somewhat improbably, hired me specifically because of that same decision pressure research, a specific, quiet piece of full-circle luck that neither of us takes for granted, that after everything, we ended up close enough to still see each other most weekends without either of us planning it that way on purpose. The whole old group, somewhat miraculously given how scattered everyone's lives eventually became, has managed to keep a real tradition alive since sophomore year of college. An annual reunion every November, timed loosely around the anniversary of that first sports banquet. All of us finding our way back to whichever city can host that particular year. And I want to tell you where everyone ended up, because I think it matters, in a story about who shows up for who, to actually follow through on showing you who they became. Zoe went into elementary education, of all things, teaching 2nd grade now in the same district we grew up in. And she told me once, over drinks at one of our reunions, that the reason she chose that path traced directly back to that 1-week junior year, watching how much damage unchecked rumor could do among people who were supposed to know better, and deciding she wanted to spend her career catching that instinct early, teaching 7-year-olds, gently, before the instinct to pile on ever really calcifies into something harder to undo. Ethan, after a rocky first year of college that he's been admirably honest with all of us about, the specific kind of honest that takes real work, eventually became a youth mentor himself, working with a nonprofit that pairs at-risk teenagers with structured group activities. And he told me, the first time he brought it up, that he'd never really forgiven himself for how fast and how completely he'd disappeared during my worst week, and that some significant part of choosing that career was an ongoing attempt to be, professionally, the person who doesn't disappear, for kids who need exactly that. Alex Reyes walked onto a Division II college soccer team as a freshman, and last I heard, was starting regularly by his sophomore season. And he still texts me before every game he plays in a program he clearly built out of habit years ago and never quite grew out of. And I make a point of texting back every single time, because some habits, once you understand what they actually mean underneath the surface, are worth keeping forever. Aisha Sharma, the sophomore we helped clear that winter, ended up going into education policy, specifically focused on school disciplinary procedures and digital evidence standards. A career path so directly traceable to her own experience that she's joked more than once that Sage and I should get some kind of professional referral fee. And Sage, obviously, still works at that same cybercrime lab, promoted twice already, occasionally consulting on cases that make the local news, and still, every single year, shows up to our reunion with some updated, increasingly elaborate version of that same joke certificate, verified friendship, no editing detected. A running bit that has, at this point, outlasted several actual relationships either of us has had, which we both find hilarious, and neither of us finds strange at all. Our most recent reunion, just last November, happened at Zoe's apartment, since she'd finally gotten a place big enough to actually host all of us, instead of cramming into whichever booth a restaurant could spare. And I want to describe that night specifically, because it captured, better than almost any single moment since graduation, exactly what all of this eventually built. Alex showed up straight from a weekend tournament, still half in his travel gear. Aisha brought an actual PowerPoint presentation, entirely as a joke, summarizing everyone's year in exaggerated corporate report style, complete with a slide dedicated to what she called Q3 Ethan growth metrics, which made Ethan laugh so hard he had to leave the room for a second. And Sage arrived last, straight from a work event, still in a blazer, and within about 4 minutes had changed into borrowed sweatpants Zoe kept specifically for exactly this occasion. Because apparently, after 7 years, everyone had learned that Sage in professional clothes is a Sage who hasn't fully relaxed yet. We ended up, as we always do eventually, telling the story again. The whole thing, for Aisha's boyfriend who was hearing it for the first time. Sitting on Zoe's couch with the specific, rapt, slightly disbelieving expression everyone gets the first time they hear it in full. And at the end, he said, genuinely, "That's insane. That could be a movie." And the whole room, without any coordination at all, said in unison, "We know," a bit so worn in from repetition that it's become its own kind of tradition. And Sage, catching my eye across the room during the laugh that followed, raised her glass slightly in my direction. A small, private toast that needed no explanation for either of us. 7 years and one fake screenshot away from 2 scared kids sitting on a concrete wall outside a school library, having somehow, against every reasonable expectation, built an entire life's worth of people who still, every single November, choose to show back up. I'm writing all of this down now, from a folding chair in the same Ridgeview auditorium where I once stood at a podium and said Sage's name out loud in front of the whole school. Because Mr. Jenkins, still at the school 6 years later, still running the digital evidence program that grew out of everything that happened to us, reached out this spring and asked whether I'd be willing to come back and talk to the current juniors and seniors about it, as part of a broader unit the school now runs every year on misinformation, digital literacy, and, in his exact words, what it actually costs a community when nobody stops to ask whether something's true before deciding how to feel about it. I said yes before he'd even finished the invitation, and then spent an embarrassing number of nights afterward trying to figure out what a 24-year-old is actually supposed to say to a room full of 16 and 17-year-olds who have absolutely no context for who I am beyond whatever brief, sanitized version of the story got handed down through 6 years of Ridgeview hallway legend by the time it reached them. Sage came with me. She didn't have to. Her actual job keeps her plenty busy. But when I mentioned the invitation, she said immediately, "Obviously I'm coming. I have a professional stake in this story too. And besides, someone needs to keep you from getting too sentimental up there and forgetting to mention the technical details that actually matter." Standing at that same podium again, older now, looking out at rows of students who were probably in elementary school when any of this actually happened, I told them the whole thing, more or less the way I've told it here. The screenshot, the 19 hours, the note passed down a row of desks, the fonts and the timestamps and the read receipts. Adam, Alex, the banquet, all of it. And I watched their faces do the thing faces do when a story stops being an abstract lesson and starts being a real, specific thing that happened to a real, specific person who is standing directly in front of them. A shift somewhere around the part where I described sitting on my bedroom floor at nearly midnight, phone face down, genuinely believing my entire life had just been decided for me by a stranger's cruelty. I told them near the end the one thing I most wanted them to actually carry out of that auditorium, more than the fonts, more than the technical verification tips Sage covered in careful, practical detail right after me, which was that in a school of over 900 kids, in a crisis that moved faster than any adult could keep up with, the entire outcome of my worst month came down to exactly one person deciding not to participate in something everyone else had already decided was fine. And that person hadn't needed permission, hadn't needed a title, hadn't needed anyone's approval. She just needed to notice and care enough about what she noticed to actually do something small and quiet about it. And I told them, looking out at 400 faces that reminded me uncomfortably of the 400 faces that had once turned against me, that every single one of them, at some point, probably sooner than they think, is going to get the exact same quiet, unglamorous chance. Some group chat, some pile-on, some moment where going along with the crowd costs nothing and standing apart from it costs something real. and that the whole story I'd just told them, the whole reason any of it turned out okay, existed only because one specific person had decided that cost was worth paying. There was a question and answer portion afterward. The specific, slightly awkward kind where a room full of teenagers takes a full, uncomfortable minute before anyone works up the nerve to raise a hand. And the first question, when it finally came, from a junior near the back who introduced herself only as Nina, was one I hadn't quite prepared for, which was, "Did you ever get mad at Sage? Like, for not saying anything sooner? Since she said she watched other people get targeted in that chat for a whole year before you." And I felt the room's attention sharpen at that. And I looked over at Sage, who nodded slightly, giving me room to answer honestly rather than diplomatically, and I said, "That's a fair question. And the honest answer is, no, not really." Because by the time I understood the full weight of what staying silent had cost her personally, back in 8th grade, I understood that the silence wasn't cowardice. It was self-preservation learned the hard way. And asking her to have been braver sooner would have meant asking her to risk getting hurt again with no guarantee anyone would even notice this time. And I think the actual lesson isn't that one person should have to carry the entire weight of speaking up alone for years. It's that schools, all of us, need to build enough trust and enough real consequences for cruelty that speaking up doesn't have to feel like walking into traffic every single time. Sage added, taking the microphone I passed to her, that the actual turning point for her wasn't some sudden burst of courage. It was one specific moment of somebody else noticing her first. Me sitting down at her table in art class, effectively, before she'd done anything remarkable at all, just being curious about a sketchbook. And that taught her something she said she still uses in her actual professional work now. That trust almost never starts with a grand gesture. It starts with somebody paying attention to a person everyone else has decided is background noise. And that attention, offered early enough, before any crisis, is usually what actually determines who shows up for who when the crisis eventually comes. A boy near the front, who'd been sitting through the whole assembly with his arms crossed in the specific posture of a kid determined not to seem impressed by anything, raised his hand and asked bluntly, "So what happened to the guy, Adam? Do you ever talk to him now?" And I told them the honest, unglamorous truth, that I didn't. That some bridges don't get rebuilt just because enough time passes. That forgiveness and reconciliation aren't actually the same thing. And that it was okay, genuinely okay, to hold both truths at once, that I didn't wish him continued suffering, and that I also wasn't required to pretend the friendship could simply pick back up where it left off. A nuance that I could see landing on a few faces in that room, with the specific relief of hearing an adult, even a fairly young one, admit that not every hard thing resolves into a neat, forgiving bow. After the assembly, Mr. Jenkins walked us out to the parking lot, looking older than I remembered, a little grayer at the temples, but with the same calm, steady presence that had made him the one adult I trusted enough to walk into his office with actual proof all those years ago. And he told us before we left that Principal Tanaka had retired the previous spring, but that she'd specifically asked him to pass along a message if we ever came back to speak, which was, verbatim, "Tell them I always say the exact wrong thing gets caught eventually if enough people care to look. And tell Sage specifically that she remains the single best piece of evidence I've ever seen for why schools should actually listen to their quiet kids." And Sage, hearing that secondhand compliment from a woman she hadn't spoken to in 6 years, had to turn away for a second and pretend to be looking for something in her bag. We drove back toward our own apartments that evening, mostly in comfortable silence, the specific kind two people share after doing something that mattered and doesn't need immediate discussion to process. And it was Sage, about 20 minutes into the drive, staring out the window at the same stretch of highway we'd driven 100 times by now, who finally said, out loud, "You know, I used to think the bravest thing I ever did was sit quietly in that chat for a year hoping someone would notice." And I said, "I remember. You told me that on a rail yard once. Except this one's a school parking lot, and there's no rail yard involved." And she laughed and said, "The point still stands. I don't actually think that was the bravest thing anymore." And I asked what she thought was, and she said, quietly, watching the highway lights, "I think the bravest thing was actually saying yes to sitting next to you in that art class, letting the sketchbook fall open where you could see it, because the note passing and the fonts and all of it, that was just technical work. Anyone with the right hobby could have done that part eventually. but choosing to let someone back in after you've already decided. The world isn't safe enough to trust. That's the part that actually takes something. And I did that first, before I even knew if you'd be worth it. And I said, for what it's worth, I think about that exact same thing sometimes. Standing outside that library that Friday afternoon, working up a nerve to actually show up after finding your note folded on my desk, half convinced it was some elaborate new joke at my expense, and choosing to trust it anyway. And she said quietly, I remember watching you walk up and thinking, please let this go well. I've never done anything like this before in my life. And I said, you hit it well. You looked completely calm, explaining fonts to me like you did it every day. And she said, that's called dissociating through a panic attack using PowerPoint. It's a skill. And I laughed hard enough that she had to remind me she was still driving and reached over without looking away from the road to squeeze my hand once, briefly. The same small, steady gesture she'd first offered me on that concrete wall outside the library 3 years earlier. Proof, if either of us still needed any at this point, that some people are simply worth trusting again. And, again, in ordinary moments as much as extraordinary ones. I think about that drive home more than almost any other single moment in this whole story. More even than the banquet speech, more than the framed note at graduation, because it was so completely ordinary. 2 people in their mid-20s driving back from a school assembly, comfortable enough in the silence between sentences to just exist next to each other without needing anything dramatic to fill the space. And I've come to believe that ordinary comfort, the kind that doesn't need a crisis to justify itself, is actually the truest measure of whether any of it was ever real. Because crises make for good stories, but they make for terrible foundations. And what Sage and I actually built, underneath the screenshot and the fonts and the banquet and all of it, was never really about the crisis at all. It was about 2 people who kept choosing, in the smallest and least cinematic ways possible, to keep showing up for each other long after the interesting part of the story was supposed to be over. I want to tell you honestly that I don't know exactly what the 2 of us are, in the specific way people always want a clean label for things, and I've stopped needing one. Because whatever word you'd use for a person who has now spent nearly 7 years choosing you, over and over, in small, unglamorous ways, in shoebox notes and joke certificates, and remote font analysis at 11 at night, in showing up at a driveway before the sun's even fully up because you need someone standing next to you before you can walk into a room, that word, whatever it technically is, feels a lot less important than the actual fact of it. I think back often to that Wednesday night, 9:47 p.m., the exact timestamp burned into my memory the way traumatic timestamps apparently always are, and I think about how completely, thoroughly convinced I was, lying on my bedroom floor with my phone face down beside me, that this was simply going to be the rest of my life now. A permanent, unshakable verdict handed down by 400 strangers who decided, in a matter of hours, exactly who I was. I was wrong about that, obviously, spectacularly wrong. But I don't think the actual lesson of this whole story is that things always work out, because I know for a fact they don't always. I've met enough people since then whose version of this story ended somewhere much sadder, whose sage never showed up, whose folded note never got passed down the row. And I think about them more than I probably let on. Because the honest truth underneath all of this is that I got lucky, genuinely, spectacularly lucky. That the one person in a school of 900 kids who happened to have the skills and the history and the quiet, hard-won courage to help me landed, by pure accident of scheduling and seating charts, close enough to actually notice what was happening to me before it was too late. That's exactly why Sage and I keep saying yes every time, Mr. Jenkins asks us back, and why we've since said yes to 2 other schools in neighboring districts that reached out after hearing about the Ridgeview program. Because if the actual difference between my story and the sadder ones I've since heard about really does come down to luck, then the only responsible thing to do with that luck is try to make it less random for the next kid. To build enough real structure, real trained adults, real institutional habits of asking for proof before rushing to judgment, that nobody else has to depend entirely on one particular classmate happening to have one particular antique shop hobby just to survive their own worst week. Nina, the junior who'd asked whether I'd ever gotten mad at Sage for staying quiet so long, found me afterward in the parking lot, hanging back from her friends with the specific hesitance of someone working up the nerve to say something personal. And when I asked if she was okay, she admitted, quietly, that there was a girl in her own grade right now being quietly frozen out over a rumor Nina was fairly sure wasn't true, and that she hadn't known what to actually do about it until she heard our story that afternoon. And I gave her the only real advice I had, which was, you don't have to solve the whole thing today. You don't have to have Sage's technical skills or my captain's microphone. You just have to be willing to be the one person who asks, out loud, are we sure this is even true? And let that question do whatever quiet work it's going to do from there. Because that one sentence, more than any grand gesture, is usually the actual hinge everything else swings on. I gave her my email before we left, told her to reach out if it ever got complicated enough that she needed an actual adult in her corner, and Sage, watching this exchange, squeezed my arm afterward and said, "You're getting good at this." And I said, "I had a good teacher." And she said, "Several, actually. Don't forget Mr. Jenkins. Don't forget your own parents. Don't forget Ingrid, who still asks about you by name every single time I visit the shop." And I said, "Fair. I contain multitudes of good teachers." And she said, "There he goes, stealing my own line from graduation." And I said, "Some things are just worth repeating." We stopped for dinner on the drive back, a diner off the highway that neither of us had ever been to before. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hasn't changed in 20 years. And somewhere between the appetizers and the check, Sage pulled out her phone and pulled up an old photo, one I hadn't seen in years. A picture Zoe had taken on her phone that first week back when none of us thought to document any of it properly. Grainy and slightly blurred, the two of us sitting on that same low concrete wall outside the Ridgeview Library, Sage's laptop open between us. Both of our faces caught mid-conversation, neither of us aware we were being photographed. Neither of us having the faintest idea yet what the next 3 years were going to build out of that one accidental, tentative meeting. I asked her why she still had it saved, and she said, because it's the only photo that exists of the actual beginning. Before either of us knew it was a beginning. Everything else we have is from after we already knew this mattered. But this one's from when it was still just 2 scared kids and a folded note. And I think that's worth keeping around. So I remember what it actually felt like before I knew how it would turn out. I looked at that photo for a long time in that diner booth, the two of us frozen mid-sentence. No idea yet that a fake screenshot was about to become the strange, unlikely hinge an entire life pivoted on. And I thought about all the versions of that Wednesday night that could have gone differently, if Sage had decided the risk of reaching out wasn't worth it. If I'd been too proud or too scared to actually show up at that library. If my parents had reacted differently. If Alex Reyes had never found the courage to tell Mr. Jenkins about his own bad week. If 100 small, fragile decisions hadn't landed exactly the way they did. And I felt, not for the first time, a specific, humbling gratitude for how much of any good outcome in life actually depends on people choosing, quietly, unglamorously, again and again, to show up for each other before they have any real proof it will be worth it. When people ask me now, and they do ask, more often than you'd expect, given how much time has passed, what the actual lesson of that whole story is, I've stopped giving them the version I used to give, the one about verification and proof and technical evidence, because that version, while true, was never really the point. It was just the mechanism, the specific tool that happened to be available to us. The actual lesson, the one I told those juniors and seniors in that auditorium, the one I'd tell anyone who asked, is smaller and harder to package into a tidy sentence, but it's this: that the entire architecture of cruelty, whether it's a fake screenshot or a real one, whether it's a group chat or a hallway or a whispered rumor between classes, depends completely on nobody in the crowd deciding to be the exception. And that the moment even one person decides not to participate, quietly, without fanfare, without needing credit, the whole machine develops a crack in it. Small at first, easy to miss, but real. And cracks, if enough people notice them and lean into them, eventually become the place the entire structure gives way. I think about Sage sitting silently in that dorm-adjacent version of a group chat 2 years before any of this happened to me, not participating, not commenting, simply choosing, day after day, not to be part of something she knew was wrong. And I think about how easy it would have been for her to never be noticed at all, for her small, quiet resistance to simply evaporate into the general noise of a school that had already decided who mattered and who didn't. And I think about how the only thing that changed that outcome was one person. Me, eventually, finally, looking closely enough to see it. My name is still Leo Miller. I still play a little pickup soccer on weekends, though nowhere near as competitively as I used to. And I still occasionally catch myself scrolling through some new platform's version of a rumor mill, some fresh, unverified claim tearing through a comments section with the exact same speed and the exact same confidence that once tore through my own life in under 24 hours. And every single time, without exception, I stop, and I ask, out loud if I have to, quietly to myself if I don't, has anyone actually checked if this is true? And more often than you'd think, that one small question is enough to make at least one other person pause, too. Somewhere out there right now, in some school I've never heard of, in some group chat I'll never see, there's a decent chance that some quiet kid is sitting silently at the edge of something cruel, not participating, not laughing, just watching, waiting, without any guarantee that anyone will ever notice the difference between their silence and everyone else's. I hope somebody notices. I hope it happens sooner than 3 years. And if you're that kid reading this, sitting at the edge of your own version of that crowd, I want you to know that the quiet thing you're doing right now, the simple, unglamorous act of refusing to join in, matters more than you can possibly measure from the inside of it. And someday, if you're very lucky, the exact right person is going to look over and notice, and everything after that is going to be worth every quiet, uncredited moment it took to get there.